I don't want to leave it alone. I'm going to do it again. And this time, hopefully, I'll be able to do a better job. So, is this recording? Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to actually watch this. Let's start over because this is such a great talk. It's going to be kind of like having a conversation with Alan Watts.
You show
except
up
I
for
get
your
to
friends.
dominate him
You
because
show
he
up
can't
for your
say anything
family.
in his defense.
You show up when it matters.
Yay! Alan Watts can't defend himself. Okay, great. So let's see what he said.
Welcome to my home. We're aboard the ferry boat Vallejo, which is tied up at the north end of Sausalito, close to San Francisco. And this is where I live. And you may think this place is rather weird. But that's because I've always loved weird things. I remember when I was a little boy, people used to say to me, "Alan, you're so weird. Why can't you be like other people?" Well, I thought that was just plain dull, like having the same thing for dinner every day. And as is well said, variety is the spice of life. So you will indeed find this place rather strange. And some of the things that are weird because they are just obvious and nobody ever thinks of them. Some of the most fascinating scientific discoveries have been made by people who called ordinary common sense in question. Like anybody can see that the Earth is flat. People know it's flat. And calling that fundamental assumption in question is really the beginning of geography. And when I think of...
You know, before he gets into this, I just want to interject because I felt this feeling the last time and I didn't say anything because I was kind of entranced by what he was saying. But he says, you know, the beginning of geography is the recognition that the Earth isn't actually flat. And I am so tempted to say, you know, geography is not the actual Earth, though. What he's saying is a little misleading. Because he has the same problem that I struggled with for a long, long time, which is the inability to understand the difference between the image of something and the thing itself. And all of our images, no matter what they are just that. They're just images. So when we create this relativistic, this relation between ourselves and everything else, we are only ever describing what is between ourselves and everything else. We're never describing ourselves or the other thing in and of themselves. We're only describing the relative distance between the two. Yeah. So I don't ever get to the point where I actually get to say what the other thing actually is. Absolutely. As God sees it, for example. Or in and of itself. Because if it were in and of itself, there would be no relation between me and it. It would be so far removed from me that it would be of itself. And that leaves no room for me, and that leaves no room for any definition, no background, no contrast, no ability to define or discern what that thing is. It becomes edgeless and infinite because it's in and of itself. There is no more room for anything else to describe it. So every description, everything that we imagine, every image that we have must be distinct and in between ourselves and the thing that we're talking about, describing and relating to and imagining. So, and the reason I bring this up is not to be a pedant all the way. I'm half of it, maybe even most, 99% of it is so that I'm a pedant. But there's this tiny little bit that isn't just me being a pedant. And it's because when we get into these conversations, we often forget that everything that we think of is a thought about something. Every word that we say is a word about something. Every action that we take is under the impression and expectation and assumption that we know exactly what that other thing is, based upon our imagination of what it is. But our imagination isn't it, and so we end up in these constant errors. No matter what we do, we always miss the mark. Now, when somebody says something that's charming or something that's simple and something that's maybe not simple, what's the word? Damn, I can't remember the parsimonious, where it's just so. We tend to get enveloped in that because it's so discreet, it's so sharp, it's so precise. It leaves nothing to question. And yet, we know that everything is questionable. We know that we don't know anything. And it's obvious even when he says that. People know the earth is flat. He's being satirical. He's showing through satire that they don't actually know that. But that's the extent of what knowledge actually is. And so that's what he means when he says that people know that the earth is flat, rather than saying that they think it is or perceive it is. He actually uses the word know. And I think that's very cute, and I think it's clever, and I think it's actually a bit intimidating for me. I'm intimidated by him. He's so charming, isn't he? I love listening to him. But anyway, I am not nearly as agreeable as Alan Watts is. So I tend to feel a little bit like challenged. When he starts speaking, I just want to be like, oh, but you missed this thing, this technical detail. So I agree with him on the sense that we don't know anything truly, absolutely, because knowledge itself is simply a relation. It's an image. When we know something, then we have this image of it, but we don't have it. It itself is unknowable. It itself is not a point of knowledge. The point of knowledge sits on top of it or in between it and me, the knower. But I don't ever touch it with my knowledge. It just wraps around it and envelops it and surrounds it, but it never penetrates it or becomes it. Because if it ever became it, then either it became a thought or my thought became it, but I don't have enough room to have both, the thought about it and it simultaneously. And this is the point that they are all trying to get at, I think, philosophers included, but mostly people of this particular bent. And I have played with this bent a little bit, the Buddhist bent, the Hindu bent, of trying to erase all of your thoughts so that you are in the moment where you have no room for thinking. And that's a very religious, meditative state, and I also approve of using it. And he also says in other talks that you only use meditation as a medicine, not a diet. I agree with all of that, but the problem with it is that it has this insidious notion that if you don't notice that you're thinking about something, you'll think that you're not thinking. And you can easily dupe yourself into believing that you've achieved ego death in a transcendental meditative state simply because you aren't aware of your own awareness, or you're not aware of the thoughts that are still going through your head. But when you realize that, then you realize there is no actual nirvana. To actualize nirvana is a paradox. You can't bring it down here. It's up there. You have to go up to it. You can't wrestle it down here. And it's the same as attempting to steal the grace of God. You can't steal it. It cannot be stolen. It can only be given. It can never be taken. It's things like that. So when he says the beginning of geography is the realization that the earth is not flat, what he's getting at is he's saying that we have to go against the grain of our own intuition. And that's what I'm trying to get at here, where when you try to think of nothing, you're not actually thinking of nothing. You're smuggling in things that are in your subconscious that are still madly driving, but they're not being paid attention to. You're not conscious of them, and so then you don't realize that those are part of your thoughts. The little bubbles that have yet to rise to the surface, for example, are still there. They're not gone. Nor can they ever be gone. And so when we talk about geography, that's all fine and dandy, but that doesn't tell us anything about the earth. That tells us about our image of the earth. And that's why I draw this sharp distinction between what he says here and what I'm saying now. Don't ever get to the point, if you can, because I do this every day, all day, every day. I do it all the time. I'm a sinner. He is also a sinner. He does the same problem, is to be unaware of the distinction between our imagination of something and that something itself, because we live in our heads and we experience things rationally through the lens of our mind, and we forget that we're wearing these glasses. And we think that the things that we're seeing are actually that way, but they aren't. They're something else that we can't see because it's distant from us, it's distinct from us, it's beyond us. And anything that is beyond us is inconceivable, really, because I can't bring it into my consciousness. I can only bring in so much information about it. And even then, that's only a relation between me and it. It still isn't it. It's just a relation between me and it. So yes, it might be the beginning of geography, but it is not the beginning of topology, of the actual topology of the planet. It's our conception of that topology. That sounds like a pedantic thing to say, but you'll see what I mean as it goes on.
Well, the weirdest of all things I can think of, you know what it is? Nothing. The whole idea of nothing is something that has bugged people for centuries, especially in the West. Because we have a saying in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit, which means that out of nothing comes nothing. You can't, in other words, get something out of nothing. And it's occurred to me that this is a fallacy of tremendous proportions that lie...
And I agree with him, but for different reasons. The reason that I say that it's also a fallacy to say that nothing comes from nothing is partly for the same reason, or at least I agree with the reason that he provides, which is that distinction, that necessary distinction between what we know or imagine or what we say is true and the thing that is known or the thing that is true is distinct from the truth about it. And so when we say nothing comes from nothing, that fallacy is the fallacy of not recognizing the distinction between what we conceive or think about and the thing being conceived or thought about. When we make that transgression, when we say that they're the same thing, that the thing is my thought about it, then we say nothing can come from that because I don't know what we're even talking about, because we're saying 2 + 2 = 5. Nothing is not my conception of nothing. By the time that I conceive of nothing, it has ceased to be nothing. So anything that I say about it can't be true, because whatever it is and whatever my thought about it is, by the time I think about it, I've already destroyed it. By the time I say anything about it, it's already gone. So he's absolutely right. It is a fallacy. And the fallacy is simple. It's just the fallacy of believing that the image is the thing. That believing that the thing that is known is the knowledge about the thing. That the thing being conceived is the same thing as its conception. That my image of it is so perfectly accurate that it is actually it. Or at the very least, it's indiscernible from it. Now, we know it's indiscernible from it anyway, because that's the only conception that we can have of it. We all have the same conception. We can all agree about our images of nothing, and they're all non-contradictory from each other. And we can use that as simply as we can use 0 in mathematics. No one ever argues about what the value of 0 is, and 0 is simply our image, or mathematical image, of nothing. No one's ever argued about that. What we argue about is how do you get from 0 to 1 and things like that, which we'll get into later. But I agree with him about it being a fallacy. But the reason that I think that it's a fallacy is because not only is there not anything there to conceive, because it's nothing, but also that we all have the same conception, and that conception can't be nothing, and that you can't derive a conclusion without a premise. So to say that the premise is nothing, given nothing, or out of nothing, ex nihilo, that statement, ex nihilo, is not nihilo. If you say nihilo, if you say the Latin word for nothing, nihilo, that is not nothing. It's a word representing nothing. And so when we say out of that representation comes that representation, of course it does. That's all there is to talk about when we say that that's what there is. Given P, well, yeah, no shit. Given some proposition, any proposition, well, we just conclude this same thing because that's what we've asserted to be true. So to say that you can conclude that there must be nothing that follows from nothing is absurd, because you're saying that there's a logic in between nothing and a conclusion about nothing. And that can't be, because the logic cannot itself interact with nothing. By the time that logic interacts with nothing, there isn't anything there to interact with. So it's sort of like saying the absence of evidence is not evidence. So if I say that there is no evidence that there's a God, I can't atheistically assert that there is no God without committing a logical fallacy. Now, some people would argue, and I agree, that you have to commit that kind of a logical fallacy in regards to God because God is beyond our conception of logic. And the same can be said of nothing. So if, like God, nothing is beyond our ability to rationalize with, because there's nothing there to rationalize, then we can't say that we must conclude that nothing comes from nothing, because nothing is not P. So therefore, when I say given nothing, well, then I haven't given anything. So then how could I conclude something if I haven't asserted anything, if I haven't presumed anything? If I haven't given anything, then there isn't anything to take. If I haven't had a premise, then there is no room for a conclusion. You can't have nothing as your premise and then logically conclude something, because you can't say that the absence of something is something. You can't say that the premise of nothing is nothing. You can't say that since there was nothing there, that because there isn't anything there. So then you can't derive the conclusion from logic because you're deriving it from nothing. So there isn't anything there to say is true. There isn't anything there to presume. There isn't anything there in the premise. There isn't anything there to give. Given nothing, there isn't anything to take. You can't even conclude that you can't conclude something from nothing. From nothing. Because there's nothing there to conclude that about. So how then do we arrive at our conception of nothing? Well, we erase everything that we currently know, and then we say whatever remains is our conception of nothing. And that's true. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. It means that we've removed everything that we know about. And that is why, or that everything that we're aware of. And that is why people make this fallacy so often, because people are so into their minds, and I do this all the time. I'm one of those people. I get so into my mind that I forget I'm using it. I get so into logic that I forget that it's there. I'm so used to everything being logical and rational, and I assume it so deeply into my soul that I forget that I'm assuming it, and I make the same mistake all the time. And I did it for years, even though I critically analyzed this one point for years, and I still made the same fallacy. And that's why I'm making this video, is because if I've expended this much effort, it's worth something. Because even Alan Watts does it, and I'll show you. He will do it. He will do it. Here, let's back up just a hair.
That out of nothing comes nothing. You can't, in other words, get something out of nothing. And it's occurred to me that this is a fallacy of tremendous proportions that lies at the root of all our common sense, not only in the West, but in many parts of the East as well. And it comes up as a kind of terror of nothing, a put down on nothing, on everything to do with nothing, everything associated with nothing, such as sleep, passivity, rest. And even the feminine principle is often equated with the negative principle, although women's lib people don't like that kind of thing, but when they get through understanding what I'm going to tell you, I don't think they'll object. Because what has struck me is that nothing, the negative, the empty, is exceedingly powerful.
Now, this is where he just goes on the line of almost transgressing, almost causing a logical fallacy, but not quite. He's just about to do it.
I would say, not ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing comes nothing, but I would say you can't have something without nothing.
And this is where he goes a bit further, and I would say at this point he has committed the fallacy of saying that the thing is his imagination of it, because you see how he's still drawing a conclusion. Now, he's drawing the conclusion from the fact that you can't have something without nothing. Well, where is he getting that assumption from? He's getting that assumption from the relation between something and nothing. He's getting the relation between being and nothing as his justification, not nothing itself. And that's a very subtle distinction. It's a very small step, but it's vastly implicative. So as soon as we attempt to draw a direct implication from nothing to something else, we've already dismantled the entire argument. Nothing cannot fit in any premise. So even if you were to do what Alan Watts just did, which is to conjoin nothing with being, and then say that that is necessary, and assert that that is necessary, and then say that it's obvious that that is necessary because of the relation which is well within his field. This is the logical field, which he is an artist at. He's very good at this. Or a scientist, a philosopher. He's a very good philosopher, logician at this. It's just, like I said, it's nothing to do with an error, and he's obviously not being malicious or misleading. It's simply not fully developed yet. So this idea that he has that you can conjoin nothing with being, relate the two together, and then say out of this irreducible singularity, we can then derive the nothing and the something from that conjunction. In other words, given P and Q, we can derive that both P is true and that Q is true. And in every other variable, it would be true, except P is not nothing. There is no nothing. So when you put the nothing into a conjunction, you're already committing that fallacy. It's already not nothing. It's already a conception of nothing. And you see how goddamn subtle that is. So, again, this took 15 years on this one single topic. Every fucking day to get that quantum leap. But I believe that I've exceeded Alan Watts's precision in logic in this recognition that this conjunction between being and nothing, and saying that you cannot have nothing without being, and you cannot have being without nothing, and therefore there is nothing, and therefore there is being, is false. Because you cannot say P and Q, therefore P and therefore Q, if you are saying P and not P. P being being and not P being nothing. And that is the problem. That is the fallacy that Alan Watts himself did not even see when he did this. And I don't blame him because, again, it's so slippery. You think you've got it, and it's because you get this conception of nothing and you think that is nothing. And it isn't. It is not to be used as a variable in that way. Because nothing is inconceivable, there is no conception of it. Therefore, there is no true, accurate concept of nothing. Therefore, anything that you say that you think that you know about nothing must be false. The only thing that we know is that nothing is not being. So then we have not being and being. And if you can join those, you get a paradox from which you can draw any conclusion. And that is what he's done here. And he has drawn a conclusion, and it is valid. But the problem is that the conception of nothing is being smuggled in and represented as if it were nothing. And that just simply isn't the case. And people will all disagree with me because he's so charming and I am not. And so he'll say, well, someone will say, well, yeah, but you're missing the point. It's yin-yang. Yeah, no, everybody understands that point. Everybody knows what he's saying. It's so easy to understand what he's saying. What's difficult to understand is what I'm saying, which is why people will naturally gravitate to what he's saying instead, because it's parsimonious. It's much simpler, it's less complex, and people don't have to worry their little heads about what I'm saying. But unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, but as intelligent as this man is, and as much respect as I have for him, and as intimidating as he is, as popular and intelligent and charming as he is, unfortunately, he has erred here. So, when you say, oh, you have to have nothing because you have being. You have to have a foreground because you have a background. You have to have a background because you have a foreground. How are you distinguishing the background from the foreground? That needs to be kind of rattling around in the back of your brain while you're listening to the rest of what he's saying, and you'll start to see what I'm saying. The image that he has of nothing is he is imagining that there is a trough and then there is a crest, and if you put them together, you get a wave, right? And everything is wiggly, and there you go. He's saying there's a shadow on one side of the reference frame, and then there's a light somewhere else. And because there's the shadow, then we can discern the light. And because there's the light, we can then discern the shadow. And that is true. But then when you put nothing in there, you forget that by the time that nothing is in there, nothing is so dark and so black and so void and so exceedingly powerful. It either absorbs everything else in it, around it, of it, by it, adjacent to it, that it either becomes it or it becomes nothing. One of the two happens. And in either case, we don't then have room for any binary relation. We now have a singularity, either of nothing or of something, or in this case of both, indiscernibility, paradox, self-contradiction. Being and not being is a paradox. If you put both of them together in the same premise and you conjoin them, like he just did here, I'm sorry, but P and not P is a paradox. And again, I'm not making this up. He says it later in the video. Nothing is inconceivable. So if you're going off of whatever he says this. He says that there is no way to conceive of nothing. Then how do you know anything about nothing? By the time that you've conceived of it, it is destroyed, or your conception is destroyed by it. You cannot conceive of nothing. So to say that there's a relation in between it and being is absurd, for the same reason that you can't say that there's a relation that fits in an absolute singularity. And you can't say that nothing is not an absolute singularity because it excludes everything that isn't itself. And you can say the same thing about being. So they're two absolutes. And then people will say, well, yeah, just like up and down and left and right and front and back and blah, 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 blah. Why don't you get it? I do get it, and that's why I'm saying this. There is no up. It's a concept that's a relation that's definition is dependent upon down. In other words, if I were to say up in and of itself, that is meaningless. You don't have an up without a down. And that's what he's saying about nothing in being. Here's the problem. Nothing is not up. Nothing is not down. Nothing is not south. Nothing is not negative. Nothing is inconceivable. You cannot conceive of what nothing is. It can't fit in a conception. That's the problem that he's trying to show, but can't. Because if he showed it to you, it wouldn't be it. And that's what I'm getting at. You have to realize that the nothing that he's talking about is a singularity unto itself as an absolute. And absolutes can't fit in relativity. So if you were to try to take two absolutes and put them in something, you can't conjoin two absolutes into anything. It would be like combining God and the devil. It would be like combining up and down. You don't combine up and down. That doesn't make any sense. And you can't isolate up from down. That doesn't make any sense. So they don't have a direct interaction. They interact with us where we are, or they interact with some object where it is. And they say up from this point, down from this point. You always have to go back to something else. You don't ever get to just say up. You say up from some place to some other place above it. And that's what makes something up above. There has to be something below for you to reference something above. And there has to be something above for you to reference something below. But there can't only be the above in order to represent the below, because if all there was the above, then there wouldn't be a below to reference. Now, if there is both above and below, then there has to be something else, a third thing, in order to distinguish between above and below. Because above can't touch below, because what's halfway in between above and below? Well, that's where something is at. So when he says below comes from above and above comes from below, I call bullshit, because the line in between the two is neither of them, not both. But anyway, it's a very, very subtle point. It's like, if you say that you can't have being without nothing, it's simple. If you were to imagine everything that exists as one point, what is outside that point? Us perceiving this point, imagining this point. Okay, well, let's say that we're in that point. Well, then everything that we see is that point. And what exists beyond that? Nothing. And that's what he's saying. So I fully comprehend what he's saying. This isn't an issue with me comprehending what he's saying. This is an issue with what he's saying in conjunction with other things that he's already said, contradicting each other. If nothing truly is inconceivable, then any time that we conceive of it, we've already committed an error. So that means anything that we say about it is erroneous, because we can't actually interact with it because there's nothing there to interact with. So anything that we say about it is wrong. And the reason for that is because it cannot fit inside of relativity, because it's an absolute singularity. What is it that we would see if we were inside of everything? Well, we would see everything. And what would we not see? Nothing. So we don't actually see the nothing. We see everything. And what is in between that edge of everything and nothing? Because if you were to say that nothing touched that edge, so you've got us inside this point of everything, this giant singularity, and then you've got the skin of that, the peripheral surface area of everything. And then just beyond that, then you've got nothing. Is that skin a part of everything? And then you would say, well, yeah, of course it is. Well, then what's that edge of everything? Oh, well, that's part of everything. But then how could it contain itself? And then people go, well, that doesn't make any sense. And that's what I'm getting at. If you say that there is this whole world of everything, a totality of everything, does that totality contain itself? Does the set of all things contain itself? And there it is again. The problem with taking an absolute, in this case everything, and trying to fit it within relativity, in this case a self-relation, does it contain itself? Being impossible because the thing is bigger than the relation that it's attempting to have. And that's what I'm getting at. It can't fit in relativity because it's an absolute totality of everything. And if we tried to make it fit in relativity by saying, does it contain itself? Does it relate to itself? Of course it can't, and yet it must. Why? Because it must contain itself because it's in relativity, but it can't contain itself because it is itself. So then we have a paradox, and the paradox, the problem, happens because we're taking an absolute, the totality of all things, being, and we're trying to relate it using relativity, which is smaller than it is. The relation that we're attempting to ascribe to it is absorbed by it. And that's why when we say the totality of all things contains everything, and then the very next question that arises in our minds is, but then wouldn't it have to contain itself? And that's not even possible. So then it can't really exist. And that's not true. It does exist, but it exists outside of all relativity because it can't relate to itself like that. It can't relate to anything else either. If it contains everything, then why doesn't it contain nothing? And now you might be starting to see what I'm saying about this fallacy. You can't have being and nothing, because then if you have all being, is the nothing being nothing? And if so, then is that not really nothing? It's nothing being nothing now. It's not nothing. It's nothing being nothing. And then you've got yin and yang and all that stuff. Pure yin cannot exist without pure yang. However, and yet yin has yang in it. That's why you've got those little circles inside the yin yang, right? And by the way, it's not yin yang, it's yin yang. And you've got a little circle of yang inside of the little blob of yin, and you've got a little circle of yin inside the blob of yang. And ostensibly those circles would have an even further fractal nature. You never get a purity of either of them. And so that's what he's saying. So I fully understand what he's saying. The problem is you can't combine two absolutes. And you also can't say that any absolute, be it nothing or being, or indiscernibility, the halfway point in between being and nothing, all three of those are absolutes. And none of those three can fit within relativity because absolute absorbs relativity because it's a totality. A relation is between parts inside of one whole. The one whole is an absolute. So when you ask a relativistic question about the absolute, then you're asking about how one part of it relates to another part of it. But you can't ask how it, as a totality, whole unto itself, would relate to anything else because it absorbs everything. It is everything. It's a totality. It's an absolute. So there cannot be any room for relations because it pervades throughout. And he gets into this too. He says this very thing later on in the video. He will say, imagine that there's just space and space and space and space. Well, the problem is that you're not space, and yet you're conceiving of space. And that's the very problem that I'm talking about. It's the fact that nothing is absolute, and it's so absolute that you can't fit within it in order to see the edge of it. And it has no edge. And you can't conceive of something that has no edge, because by the time that you conceive, you've limited it, you've constrained it, and you've enveloped it inside your thought, inside your head. But your head isn't everything, and so that it can't fit nothing in it. And so then whatever concept that you've come up with about nothing is not actually nothing. So watch, he'll get into that here.
For how do we basically begin to think about the difference between something and nothing? I could say, there is a cigar in my right hand and there is no cigar in my left hand. And so we get the idea of is here and isn't or empty here. But behind that, of course, lies the far more obvious contrast of solid and space. Now, we tend to think of space as nothing. When we talk about the conquest of space, there's a little element, notice, of hostility in that phrase. But actually, we're talking about the conquest of distance. Space as such, that is to say, whatever it is that lies between the Earth and the Moon and the Earth and the Sun, is considered, especially since the Michelson-Morley experiment, which proved there was no ether, is considered to be just nothing at all. But to suggest how very powerful and important this nothing at all is, let me point out to you that if you didn't have space, you couldn't have anything solid. To begin with, without space outside the solid, you wouldn't know where the solid's edges were. For example, you can see me on the camera because you see a background here and all around me, and that background shows up my outline. But if that wasn't there, then you would notice, say, only the beads and the microphone here, and this would become the background. But you always have to have a background to see a figure. You just can't do without it. So that means that the figure and the ground, the solid and the space, in some way are inseparable and go together. Now,
see, and this is what I'm saying. It sounds so seductive, but it's so patently absurd to say that nothing is being and that being is nothing. Now, here's how he gets away with it. He has this idea that all the images that he's ever had are the only things that actually exist. And this is where I draw the line. How do you have an image of something if all there are images? You cannot conceive of nothing, and yet you talk about it and draw relations with it and being, and yet you say yourself that you can't even conceive of it, and yet you've conceived of something, and then you're saying that that's all that there is. So what you're saying is not that nothing and being go together, because that would be patently absurd. You're saying that the concept of nothing and the concept of being go together. And that's perfectly valid. But the problem then becomes the implication that that's all that there is that it's all relative, that it's all inside the field of relativity. And the problem with that is, if everything is relative, first of all, how do we even conceive of absolutes, like nothing and being? Where did those concepts come from? And then you can say, well, that they must come from the opposition from each other. And that's what he is arguing here. But the problem is, where does the conceiver fit? And then you can say, oh, well, that just fits on the side of being, obviously. So when the conceiver conceives of nothing, being is enveloping and surrounding, because that's what it is to conceive, like a womb. Being then must surround nothing. But if that's true, if there's some interplay in between being and nothing, and you say that the conceiver is on the side of being, then the being never penetrates into the nothing. It never absorbs it to the point where the nothing dissolves into it. And if it did, we wouldn't be here to discuss it. So he's either saying that there is no such thing as nothing, and that we only have concepts. But as I said, if all there are relations, if all there is relativity, what is being related? And what is their relativity between? And where did these concepts come from? And why do we all have them? So if everything in existence, because what he's saying is inside of itself, it's fine. You can say what he's saying and it's still logically valid. The problem is if you go beyond what he's saying and try to take into account what would happen if that's all that there was. So in his head, and I've been here too, I know what he's talking about. That's how I know he's wrong, because I used to think the same thing, and then I found out that I was wrong. So what he gets wrong is that he believes that everything is images. The problem with that is the same problem as including oneself within oneself. Where is my image from? Now, I could say, well, my image of myself is from myself. So then I'm my own image. So then what am I imagining? Oh, well, I'm imagining myself. But if I'm the self that's being imagined, then how could I also simultaneously be the self that's imagining? And then you could say, well, because everything's all relative anyway, and so we're just all the relation. And so then our self-relation is ourself. And so then, like I said, yeah, that's perfectly fine. But the problem is it doesn't go anywhere because it makes everything relativistic. If everything is relativistic, how do we have a concept of an absolute? And then you could say, well, that's just the edge of relativity. That's pointing towards something that isn't there because it's beyond relativity, and only relativity exists. And that's all internally, logically valid and internally integrated. Until you ask the question, if everything is an image, what is creating that image? Who is the imaginer? And what is the imagined thing that we're drawing an image, an imagination of? In other words, if there is no nothing, then how is it that I have a conception of it? If there is no being, how do I have a conception of that? If there are no absolutes, then why do there exist relations between them? If something cannot exist without being, and both of those are just inextricable parts of a relation, instead of them being fully fledged things of their own, then where did this relation come from? And how did this relation emerge? If there's no being in and of itself, and there's no nothing in and of itself, just like there's no north in and of itself, and there's no south in and of itself, then where does north come from, and where does south come from? And then he says, the relation between the two. And then I say, how does that relation exist if neither of the two exist? If there is no north and there is no south, then how does the north and the south exist? What is that relation between two things that aren't really there? So when you really boil everything that Alan Watts says down, you get a very clear picture, but it's very limited, because what he's saying is the TV screen inside your head is the world. And he's saying when you turn that TV on and when you turn that TV off, the world ends and begins for you. So it doesn't necessarily impact everybody else's TV screen, obviously, but it impacts yours. So therefore, that's all that there is. And like in Memento, I'm tempted to say, when I close my eyes, the world keeps spinning. The world doesn't end because I can't see it. There is an independence to the world that goes beyond any conception of it. And every relation that he talks about is a relation between things. So you can't have a relation between two relations because that it becomes this self-inclusive paradox. Again, it's like, does the set of all things contain itself? Does everything contain itself as a totality? Does it contain itself? Of course it can't. Because if it did, it would both be the container and the contained. And you can't have a box that includes itself. The box can't fit around itself. It is itself. So then there's no room for this relation. So then the relation doesn't exist, or the thing doesn't exist, but there's not enough room for it to be both. There's not enough room for there both not to be any absolutes, and yet for there to be a relation between them. If they don't exist in and of themselves, independently of each other, then they just don't exist. And if they don't exist, then there's no relation between them. So if yin can't exist without yang, then we're only ever talking about yin-yang. We're talking about the relation between the two, the combination between the two. And then we're just talking about some indistinguishable blob, because how much of it is yin? How much of it is yang? Well, you know, when you see it. Then what is pure yin? Show me an example of pure yin. Well, I can't, because everything has yang in it. Well, then how do you even know that yin exists? If everything is relative, there is no yin. What is this yin? It's just some image that you've created, and I just dissolved it. Because if you don't have yin, then you don't have yang. And if you don't have yang, then you don't have yin. Well, then you don't have either of them, because they're both just opposites of each other. You have to have something that exists beyond them in order for you to tell what that is. So like he says, if you don't have a foreground and a background, then you can't have the thing. And if everything is an image, then that's the foreground. Then there must be some background. So then relativity must be related to something else. So then there must be these absolutes. So then when we conceive of nothing, we've already committed a fallacy, because you can't conceive of nothing, because the conception of nothing cannot be nothing. So then we aren't talking about nothing, we're talking about the concept of nothing. So then there really isn't a relation between nothing and the concept of nothing, because pure nothing has no relations to anything else, because it's nothing. And it's the same thing with being. Being is too big for there to be any room for a relation between it and anything else. And nothing is too small for there to be a relation between it and anything else. But there can't be any relativity, there can't be any yin-yang if there's only yin or if there's only yang. And so then there is no yin and there is no yang, and then there is no yin-yang. You can't have a relation between two things if neither of them exist. If the extent of their existence is simply the relation between them, if the only thing that exists is the relation between them, then they don't exist. So there is no relation. You have to have a relation between things. You can't have a relation between nothing.
We find this very commonly in the phenomena of magnetism and electricity. A magnet has a north pole and a south pole, and a battery has a positive pole and a negative pole. There is no such thing as a magnet with one pole only. That's supposing we equate with north with south, and north with is and south with isn't. Then we see we can't do without the two of them. You can chop the magnet in two, supposing it's a bar magnet, and you'll just get another north pole and south pole on the end of each piece.
A form of ketamine was recently approved by the FDA for depression. Ketamine, isn't that a horse?
And so in the same way, a current will not flow through an electric circuit until the negative pole is connected as well as the positive. Because the current does not wait in the wire like water in a hose and then begin to flow when you, as it were, connect it with the negative pole like turning on the nozzle. There won't be any current in the wire at all until its end point, which is the negative, is established. So what this is trying to get into our basic logic is this, that there isn't a sort of fight between something and nothing. You know the famous words of Hamlet, to be or not to be. That is the question. It isn't. To be or not to be is not the question. Because, as I think I've shown, you can't have a solid without space. And therefore you can't have an is without an isn't, a something without a nothing, a figure without a background. And we can turn that right the other way around and say you can't have space without solid. Because imagine nothing but space. Space, 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 with nothing in it at all forever. But there you are imagining it, and you're something in it. To have the whole idea of there being only space and nothing else at all is not only inconceivable, but perfectly meaningless.
And yet, I'm sorry to say this, Alan Watts. I love you, man. Rest in peace. You're wrong. It is meaningful. And it is conceivable to derive this meaning approximately. While I cannot fit the entirety of nothing in my head, and that's true, he is right about that, because nothing is an absolute. There is no room for relativity in totality. There is room for relativity in parts of it, which is why I can say that there was nothing in his left hand, even though that's not actually totally true, it's relativistically true. In other words, it's like a part of nothing, and that's the part that exists. So it doesn't mean that there is no nothing, and it doesn't mean that there is no being, and it doesn't mean that there is no line in between them. It does not mean that there are no absolutes, simply because they can't be conceived of totally. It means that we can never fully conceive of them because the fullness of them exceeds our comprehension. Because the fullness of them absorbs the relation that we would otherwise attempt to make with it. It supersedes that relation, and it consumes the relation such that there's no more room for relation. Totally. But in part, there is. That's why he was able to make the distinction between the cigar in his right hand, in his right hand and nothing in his left hand. But it wasn't totally nothing. It was a relativistic part of nothing. And that means nothing in the relation to cigars. Nothing as it relates to cigars. There is a cigar here, there is not a cigar there. There is a cigar in his right hand, there is nothing in his left hand. That's relative nothing. And that is conceivable because as he just showed and demonstrated, you can conceive of that. And what is that? That's a relativistic part of nothing, without it being the entire totality of nothing. So while he might be accurate when he says that you can't conceive of nothing, how else did you name it? How are we even able to know that? Well, because we have approximated what the totality of nothing would be without fully fitting that into our head. We have an idea or a direction about what that would be without having it itself expressed. In other words, when I imply something without explicitly saying it, there is still meaning in the implication, even if I haven't expressed the meaning, even if it isn't fully developed as an entire total unit. It's approximated, and you get close enough to it that you can understand it. And that's the part that he misses. And I miss that all the time too. It's not an easy thing. This is not easy. That's why Alan Watts is Alan Watts. But it is possible. It's just very difficult the simple way to put it is that while nothing itself is so grandiose, so vast, so absolutely inconceivable, that in its totality, it would never fit in my head. That's true. However, part of it can fit in my head. I can fit some of it in my head. It's not that it's an all or nothing question. It's not that either all of it fits in my head or none of it does, which is unfortunately the way that Alan Watts perceived it, and that's the same way that I perceived it for years. And like I said, that's what I mean when I say this is not easy. It takes years to get to this point, but you can, if you dedicate yourself long enough and you really care about this, you can get to a point beyond what he's saying to realize, actually, Alan Watts, you're wrong. You can conceive of nothing in parts. You can receive a little piece of it. You will never get the full puzzle, but you will get pieces of it. You won't get none of it, you'll get pieces. So while it is completely inconceivable in the sense of it being a totality, it is conceivable partially. I can conceive of parts of it partially. And that's what I build my conception of nothing from, is all these not this, not that, not here, not there. And I combine all the heres and theres and thises and that's, and then I negate all of them, and then that's what my approximation of nothing is, and that's my conception of nothing, and that points to nothing, but it isn't nothing, but it points to it. And that's why I say what he's saying is wrong, because what does that point to? Does that point to being? Not at all. If I say not this, not that, not you, not me, not him, not her, not them, not us, not God, not the devil, not anything, and I just tell you to list everything that you could possibly think of in your head and then systematically annihilate all of those things, then since you don't know about everything, since there's some stuff that exists that you don't know about, you won't have negated those things, because I only asked you to negate the things that you do know about. So if you only negated the finite number, the small list, relative to the totality of all existence, of things that you do know about, and told you to systematically annihilate all those things, what remains is not nothing, but a whole bunch of stuff that you never knew about. So when he says that you can't have one without the other, that's only true in relativity. And it is true in relativity, but it's not true outside of relativity, because otherwise there wouldn't be anything there to relate. If you can't have an up without a down, then there is no up and there is no down. And that's true, there isn't. If you go out and you look for it, you'll never find it. What is up? Go point at up for me. Oh, it's over there. Okay, I'll go to that point that you pointed at, and now that I'm there, now where's up? Oh, even further up. Okay, I'll go there then. Okay, now that I've gone there, now where is it? Oh, well, it's over there. Because you'll never be able to point straight up. What are you pointing straight up from? So you could be on, let's say, Japan, and you could point upward from there, right? And so now you're pointing, let's say, east. Well, then you could go to California, and you could point up, and now you're pointing west. That's a completely different area, but you just said up was east. How could you say up is east and yet west? Well, that's because there is no such thing as up. It's not a place. It's just a relation. And that's what he's saying about being and nothing. He's reducing them to up and down. He's reducing them to a relation. He's saying that you can't have either of those things. But if you can't have either of those things, then how the fuck are you conceiving of it? And what is the relation between if it isn't between them? Now, it's easy to say what the relation is between up and down. Up does not relate to down as far as where it is. Up relates to the person that's calling it up or down. Up and down from the observer, not from down itself, because there is no down. What the hell is down? It's down from the observer. It's down from the conceiver. It's down from the person who's making the distinction between up and down. It's not down itself, because what's down for somebody in Tokyo is up for someone in California, and vice versa. So they obviously can't contradict each other and still be true, but what they could do is they could say up from the person in Tokyo. Oh, okay, well then that's localized, distinct, relative, and it's fine. But there's no absolute up. That's why they contradict each other if you attempt to make it that way. And that's why he says they don't exist in absolute form. They only exist in relation to each other. And like I said, you can argue that point all day long, but then you always evade the question of answering the question. If that's true, and they only have a relation, and they themselves don't exist, then what are they relating to? They can't relate to something that doesn't exist, and yet you just said they can't exist without the relation. So if all they are the relation, then there is no relation, because they don't exist to have a relation. They are the relation. Well, if that's all they are, then they aren't there, because there's nothing there to relate. Up does not relate to down. Up relates to the observer, and down relates to the observer, what is beneath or above the observer, not what is beneath or above or the beneath. That's what he's getting wrong. You see, when I say that the above is defined by the below, that's impossible to apply to the real world, because again, if up were defined by the below, what is up from someone in Tokyo is down for someone in California. If you were to extend that line indefinitely and keep the direction, because up and down are directions, right? If you were to keep the direction but extend the line indefinitely from some man standing in Tokyo, and you were to say, okay, point up, and he points in a direction, and then you say to someone in California, point down, and they point in the same direction as the person in Tokyo pointing up. Now explain that to me, Alan Watts. Explain how that's possible, that I can ask two different people the same question and get two completely different, contradictory, mutually exclusive results. And then you say, well, therein lies the problem. You're pretending that up is an absolute and it's just relative. But you yourself say, Alan Watts, that the only thing that up is relating to is down. And you are saying that if up relates to down, that we then have a conception of what is up and what is down. And I call bullshit, because Tokyo man's up is California man's down. They don't relate to each other. They relate to the observer. So the observer sits in between the two and says, what is above me is up and what is below me is down. Not what is above is above the below, and what is below the above, because that uses itself in its own definition, or it relates to something that isn't relatable. Because it's contradictory when you apply it to the real world, it doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is not because the world is wrong. The reason that it doesn't work is because the definition is wrong. Up relates to the observer. When the observer says up, they mean up from themselves. They don't mean up from down. They mean up from themselves. That's why up and down don't exist. They don't relate to it as far as like anything that's beyond some relation to an observer. They exist in relativity, but they don't exist in an absolute form. There is no absolute up. There is an absolute nothing. And there is an absolute being, but there is no absolute up and there is no absolute down. That's why if I ask that same man, when I asked him to point up in Tokyo, and I asked the man in California to point down, they both pointed in the same direction, because there is no absolute up and there is no absolute down. Now, if I ask the same two men, one in Tokyo and the other one in California, I ask them both, what is nothing? They can both tell me that it's the absence of all things. How is that possible to receive the same answer from two completely different people that have two completely different observers? And yet, Mr. Alan Watts, they have the exact same non-contradictory answer. And yet they contradict each other instantly when they are asked about north and south and up and down and every other analogy that he uses. So as I just said before, it's not that I don't understand what he's saying. It's that he doesn't understand what he's saying. He's trying to work it out. That's what philosophers do. I make mistakes all the fucking time. I probably have made several in this conversation, just haven't realized it. Same as him. But what he didn't realize, and this is why we all have to work together, because I can't see everything, he can't see everything, but I can see what he can't see. And you can see what I didn't see. And someone else can see what you didn't see. And we all see what each other didn't see. What he didn't see is that there is an absolute nothing, and there is an absolute being, or an absolute everything. But there's not an absolute up, and there's not an absolute down. And there's not an absolute north, and there's not an absolute south. So he's correct when he says there is no absolute north and there is no absolute south. He's incorrect when he says that it's analogous to being and nothing. It is not analogous. They are absolutely distinct. Up and down are relativistic, and they don't extend into an absolute. That's why they contradict each other. When you ask two different people, they're going to give you two different answers, because they're relative. But when you ask someone about being, they always give you the same answer. And when you ask someone about nothing, they always give you the same answer. But when you ask them about what is north, they'll always give you a different answer. And when you ask them all about what is positive and what is negative, they're going to give you the same answer, because that's a physical phenomenon, right? But it isn't north and it isn't south, because that isn't relating to the observer. It's relating back to some physical object. Nothing is subjective. Up is relative. Positive is objective. We can all agree on what is subjective and what is objective, but we all have different answers about what is relative. And that's what destroys Alan Watts' theory in the end. As beautiful and charming as it is, as logically valid and integrated as it is, it fails to recognize the subjective and the objective, and it only pays homage to the relative. And unfortunately, it eats its own tail and becomes a paradox unto itself. Because if everything is made out of images, then what are the images being projected onto? And who is the one that's imagining all these images? And what are these images actually of? They can't just be images of images of images of images of images, for the same reason there can't be space and then space and then space and then space and then space. It's the same problem. So he was so close. If he just worked it out, he would have gotten there.
Because we always know what we mean by contrasts. We know what we mean by white in comparison with black. We know life in comparison with death. We know pleasure in comparison with pain, up in comparison with down. But you will notice of all these things that they must come into being together.
And I also noticed, Alan Watts, that all those are different things in different domains. They are not all part of the same domain. Up is not part of the same domain as pain and pleasure, which are not part of the same domain as white and black. White and black, let's start there. So those are colors. And he's talking loose and fast and off the cuff, and I understand that. But like I said, this is a pattern with him. It's not a fluke. He says this all the time. He compiles all this stuff and then demonstrates that it's, to him, all in one domain. And that's not true. They're not all part of one domain. So let's take black and white starting off. Black and white are not the same thing as up and down. Up and down, as I've already shown you, are relative. It depends on where you're standing. If you're standing in one place, they're pointing in one direction. If you're standing in another place, they're pointing in another direction. If I ask those same people that are pointing in different directions what white and black are, they'll give me the same answer. If I ask those same two people to point up, they'll point in two different directions. So they're not part of the same domain. They're very distinct. White and black are colors, and they're probably being used in the conventional sense here as objective colors of light. So black absorbs all light and white reflects all light. So when you see white, you're seeing blue and red and green and yellow and magenta and all that stuff all mixed together. And we know that because if you were to break light down using a prism, then you'll see all those individual colors in the rainbow. So we know that white is composed of all those colors. So when I ask someone what is white, then they know that it's all of the colors combined into one when we're talking about visible light. And when I ask that person what is black, then they know that that's the negation of all those colors. It's where it doesn't reflect any of those colors. And that's why I don't see any colors in it, because there are no colors that it reflects. And what are all the other colors? And we all know that too now. All the colors that we see are just the ones that are reflected off the objects that they're reflecting off of. So when I see something green, it's just simply the object reflecting only green light without reflecting any of the other colors, more or less. So white and black are something that everyone can agree on, that has eyes. Anyone that has eyes and the ability to speak and understand a language that represents those things will be able to answer in the same way about what is white and what is black. And you'll never get a contradiction. But you'll always get a contradiction if you ask them about what is up and what is down. If you ask them to point up, they'll all point in different directions. If you ask them to point down, they will all point in different directions. None of their lines will ever not intersect. All of the lines in between up and down for every observer will intersect at some point, because everybody occupies a different place, and up and down is relative to that place that you're standing, that place that you're at. White and black don't depend on where you're standing. White and black are objective facts that you can physically measure and determine regardless of where you're standing and who you are and what you're doing. Pleasure and pain are, again, completely different. Those are subjective experiences of something. Now, while you can say, I'm going to measure the chemical, there's this certain chemical that, for example, opioid drugs suppress so that you don't have this chemical floating around. And those are usually analgesics. I love that word. It sounds so dirty. All it means is it's a pain reliever. So all the pain relievers basically work the same way. They suppress this particular chemical that gets released into your nervous system that your brain recognizes as pain. And that's what he's getting at. If that's all he meant, that's objective because that's chemicals. It's just the presence or absence of chemicals. But if he means the subjective experience of pain and pleasure, in other words, something that you would want to pursue, pleasurable, something that you would want to avoid, painful, then we can argue about, for example, twisting the nipples or something like that. Some people like that. It releases that same chemical, but they like it when it happens. Is that pleasure or pain, Alan Watts? Is candle wax on the nipples pleasure or pain? And if I ask you what that is, and then I ask someone else what that is, I'm going to get two completely different answers. Unlike if I ask them about black and white. Unlike if I ask them about being and nothing. Everybody can agree on what being and nothing are. And everybody can agree on what is pain and pleasure, even though those are subjective. And even though when someone is asked to give an example of what they perceive subjectively as being painful or pleasurable, they'll give you two completely different answers, but they all point towards the same thing. So most of the time, people are using pain and pleasure to mean something that you would want and something that you would not want, something that you pursue and something that you avoid, something that is attractive and something that is repulsive. And that's what they mean when they say pleasure and pain is the subjective experience. But we all know what that subjective experience is because we're all subjects and we all have the same subjective value, same subjective field. Relativity is unique in the sense that every single time you ask someone a question about a relation, they give you a completely different answer. It's the only field that does that. In the subjective field, we all agree. We all know what we mean by something that's subjectively aversive. That's something that you don't want to be around. It's something that you avoid. And we all know what that means. And if we were all given an infinite number of lists of things that we find painful and pleasure, the vast majority of us would agree on most of them. And the few times that we disagree, if we boil it down to something that you either pursue or avoid, you will either pursue or avoid something eventually. If we give you enough time, you'll eventually either avoid this thing or you'll pursue it. So we know that, and we can objectively measure how close they get to it, how often they engage with it, interact with it, have contact, physical contact with it, how often that they choose to go into rooms that they believe that's what's happening in it, or that it will happen to them if they go past this area. Then they'll either go past the area or not, and those are the only two things they can do, and so then they'll either pursue it or avoid it. And then we can objectively state that it's either pleasurable or painful for them. Unlike up and down, which are purely relative, black and white and pain and pleasure are not relative. Black and white are objective, and pain and pleasure are subjective. And subjective things and objective things are things that we all agree on because they don't depend on where you're standing. Relative things depend on where you're standing because they have to deal with relations. And so every time I deal with a relation, I'm in it or I'm out of it. Now, if I'm in it, then I'm opposite of whoever it is that I'm relating to. If I'm out of it, then I'm tangential to both of them or orthogonal to both of them. And that's why you get a contradictory answer when you ask about relations. Because as soon as you go outside of the relation, you get a completely different answer about what that relation is in relation to the people that are in the relation. If I ask two people who are in love what their relation is like, I'm going to get two different answers, right? But they'll be similar because they'll be in love. If I then go to anybody else that's outside the relationship and ask them to describe it, they're not going to feel the same feelings because they're not in it. So they'll describe their relation as something that neither of them would accept as being the exact relation that they feel, because only they know what that is, because they're in it. And that's the nature of relativity. To say that that is like being in nothing is to say that pain and pleasure is like black and white. It's not. What's painful to me is not painful to you. What's pleasurable to me is not pleasurable for you. What's black to me is black to you, and what's white to me is white to you. Unless one of us is blind and we don't even know what that is, then they're going to be the same answer. So he doesn't distinguish between these, and that I wasn't lying. The man really does believe that everything is relative. He really does believe that everything is just concepts. And it's so ironic because he talks about people that are like that live in their own heads, that have conceived of things so deeply. And he has. You have to give him credit, he has. But yet he gets so into that he forgets that there's a world outside of it. That there's a distinction between pain and pleasure and black and white. They're not part of the same fields. And therefore they cannot be used interchangeably. There's a very distinct difference because logical interchangeability means that you have to have the same conclusion. Given an interchange of the premises, you must receive the same conclusion, and that is provable and disprovable. And I just disproved you cannot equate pain and pleasure as a relation to the relation between blackness and whiteness, because the relation between blackness and whiteness is objective, meaning everybody agrees on it. The difference between pain and pleasure is subjective, which means it depends upon the subject who's entering into it, into that relation. That relation is a subjective relation. It depends on who you are. Blackness and whiteness is an objective relation. It depends only on the thing that you're looking at. The object. Objective relations depend on the object. Is the object white or is the object black? And that is what will determine the answer that you'll receive when you ask the question, is this white or black? Conversely, and quite distinctly, if you were to ask someone what is painful and what is pleasurable, their answer will depend on who is the subject who is experiencing this pain and pleasure. Is it me? Is it you? Who is it that's experiencing this pain or this pleasure? And that is the dependence of what the answer will be. He misses this, glides right over it as if that didn't exist. Because to Alan Watts, everything fits within the field of relativity. Why? Because everything can be related to, everything can be conceived of, everything can be related to. So if you form a relation with it, then you'll be aware of that relation. But that doesn't mean that that's all that there is. And you have to recognize this at some point, because you have to recognize that the relation exists between you and some other thing. It isn't a relation with another relation. It's a relation with a relative, something that's relative.
You don't have first something, then nothing, or first nothing, and then something. Something and nothing are two sides of the same coin. And as you know, if you take a coin and you file away the tail side of it, and you file that side of it away completely, the head side will disappear as well. So, in this sense,
Yeah, but the problem, Alan Watts, is there is still something outside that coin. So even in this analogy, it still breaks down. I get what he's saying. You can't have one without the other. In the relation, you can have one without the other if you get rid of the relation. What does that mean? It means that if you chop that same coin in half, instead of filing one side away, you chop it in half. Now you have a heads on one side and a blank, where what used to be the tails end would be, is now halfway in between the coin that once was. And now the heads of that coin is opposite a blank side that you would have chopped away from the tails side, whose opposite is now blank as well. So what does that mean? You can chop it in half, but you can't file it away. So what does that then mean? Well, it means that the relation between heads and tails is not relative, it's objective, and it depends on the object. And it means that if you were to say that the blank side is the tail side, and you've created two coins out of what was once one coin, then what is tails and what is heads is just a relation on a coin, right? Because if I cut that same coin in half, then I'll end up with a tails end. Just like if I were to cut the magnet in half, I'd end up with two different north and south poles, or positive and negative, as he says. So that's all fine and dandy. But the problem happens when you say, you can't have a heads without a tails on the coin. So therefore, having the coin and not having the coin is the same thing as a heads of a coin and a tails of a coin, because you either have the coin or you don't have the coin. The coin is either facing heads or it's facing tails, relative to the observer. You either have the coin or you don't have the coin, not the coin either exists or it doesn't exist. Because while you may not have that coin, someone else might, right? And then let's say you destroy the coin. Now there isn't a coin, but there once was. So that's what makes it not so good of an analogy. And I understand that in philosophy, you have to be careful with analogies, because there are no analogies that are perfect. There's always a limit where it's like, well, that obviously wouldn't fit anyway. Why are you even driving at this? The point is that being can exist without nothing, inside of itself, with no relation. And it must, because if you have, like he said about nothing, if you had just nothing where it's space and space and space and space and space, but you're still there imagining this. And if you were to have being, then it would just be being and being and being and being, and yet there would still be nothing outside of it. And that's what he's getting at. And so he says that they're two parts of the same coin. What's beyond that coin? Oh, well, more nothing. But I thought you said nothing was in the coin. Oh, well, there's just nothing beyond it. But yet, if there's nothing beyond it, then how can it be both beyond it and yet in it? You see how that breaks down? It's like, so if being and nothing is a coin, and either you have it or you don't, or it's heads or it's tails, that all makes sense until you realize what is beyond the coin. Oh, well, you are. Okay, and what's beyond you? The coin. So it's just you and the coin. Okay. Then you are the coin. Right? Because if everything is relative, and I'm just saying what Alan Watts would have to say. I'm using reductio ad absurdum here. I'm taking it to its logical conclusion. If you were to equate being with, let's say, heads and nothing with tails, and they're both part of the same coin, and then you ask the question, who's holding the coin? Or who's looking at the coin? Or what is beyond the coin? Which is the best question. What's beyond the coin? So if you say that being and nothing are both two sides of the same coin, what's beyond that coin? And then you say you, right? But that can't be true because you exist. So you're part of being. So you're part of the heads part of the coin. So you can only ever see the tails part, but you can't see the heads part because you are the heads part. If everything was being, if I am being, and I'm on one side of the coin, then I can't see that side because I'm on it. I am it. I can't see the rest of it. Okay, well, then you're beyond the coin. You're holding it. Okay, so then what's beyond me? Well, the coin. Okay, so if it's just me and the coin, right? And I neither exist nor not exist. How do you explain that? And then you could say, well, then your take, or the person that's holding the coin or observing the coin, the one that's observing the coin, is indiscernible, both to themselves and to the coin, because they are beyond either being or nothing, because being and nothing are wrapped up into the coin. So I can't be being because that's part of the coin, and I can't be nothing because that's part of the coin. So then I must be something in between being and nothing, or outside of nothing and being. So then I'm indiscernible. Okay, now, if all there is indiscernibility and then a conjunction between being and nothing that are inside of a relation where both of them require the other, am I required in this or not? Is the observer required? When we have this coin, is everything in that coin, or am I outside the coin? When I observe the coin, am I outside of it? Yes, of course, there has to be a relativistic distance, right? In order for me to discern that there even is a coin, I would have to be beyond it. So then how could I be beyond the coin if the coin has everything in it, being, and nothing, and yet I'm not in the coin? And if I am in the coin, then nothing is outside of the coin, and then nothing can't be both outside and in the coin at the same time. So if I'm not nothing, and I'm not part of the coin, and I'm indiscernibility, because we don't have any other word for it, we just don't know what that would be. It's neither being nor nothing. If that's the case, then both being and nothing are actually drawing their existence from me, and I'm drawing my existence from them. Now, if that's the case, then the relation exists between me and heads and tails. And so then we're all part of one unit, right? And that's his whole point. And then the problem with that is, what's beyond that? How is it that I was able to conceive of that whole thing all being part of one thing? Because we've got the coin now, and then we've got whoever's looking at it, and now what's beyond that? So then the analogy breaks down. And this is what I was saying. It always happens this way when you enter into these conversations about nothing and about being, especially if you're really honest about being and you call it everything, and you say it's a totality, it's all the things, right? Then you really get into a fucking quandary, because there can't be anything beyond all the things. So then you say that nothing is beyond all the things. So then there isn't a nothing. So then there's no relation. So it breaks down. If all that they are is two sides of one coin, and there's only two sides, and there's only one coin, where do I fit? So, if I'm neither being nor nothing, and I'm observing this, and I'm indiscernible to either being or nothing, I'm neither being nor nothing, I'm just indiscernible, then the problem happens when I say, is the relation between me and the coin the same relation between the sides of the coin? The problem happens there, because if my relation to the coin is the same relation as the heads to the tails and the tails to the heads, then I should be discernible in the same way that black is discernible by being opposed to white and the contrast. So then how could I be both indiscernible and yet discernible from being and nothing in conjunction with each other in this coin? I am necessarily outside of it because I'm observing the coin. So what am I? I'm not being and I'm not nothing, but yet that's all there is. So then there has to be this indiscernibility. And that's why I say that there's three absolutes. And they are related, but they're related causally dynamically. And like he said, it isn't that one comes first and then the other one. That's linear causality. And again, I agree with Alan Watts on that point. Because at the origin, there can't be anything before the beginning. So let's say that nothing was first and then being came after. He's right when he says that can't be. Why? Because if there were nothing and then there was something, what happened before the nothing? Nothing. But then nothing happened before itself, and that's impossible. So he's right about that. Being and nothing do create each other simultaneously. But there has to be a third absolute, the one holding the coin, the one looking at the coin, the one perceiving the coin, in order for there to be the coin. There has to be something outside of it also to contrast with it. And then there has to be something outside of that to contrast with that. And then there has to be something outside of that to contrast with that. And then we end up with another impossibility. So the moment that we try to reduce this down into a coin or a relation or anything else, then it becomes impossible. Why? Because we're taking two irreducible things and we're conjoining them as if they could be reduced to the same thing. And that's the issue that he makes here. That is my ultimate issue with it, is if you were to take a coin where the tail side is nothing, it would not have a tails because it's nothing. You see how there always has to be a contrast. If the coin is something, then it can't have anything outside of itself without it being nothing. So there has to be that contrast. So while they are inseparable, and I do agree with that, and there is a causal dynamism, and they are always dynamically interacting with each other, what is being interacting with? What is being related to? How do we get being from nothing? Well, We get being from the distinction between nothing and the indiscernible. We get heads from the relation between the observer and the coin. We don't get it between the heads and the tails of the coin. We get it from the one looking at the heads or the tails, because the one looking at heads sees the heads, discerns the heads, says the heads is facing some way. If that observer wasn't there, then we would not be able to conceive that there even is a heads, because there would be no one there to perceive it. So it almost gets there, but it doesn't quite get there. It's like how being and nothing and indiscernibility, as the three absolutes, not two, three absolutes, create each other dynamically, like he said, except he forgot about the third absolute, but there is a causal dynamism between them. He got that part right. The problem is that he fails to recognize that these are capable of existing independently of each other. And here's why that's necessary. If one of those created the other, where did the other come from? Oh, well, the other one. But that's not possible for the same reason that they cannot have created themselves. They weren't there yet to have created. So if I say tails creates heads, where did tails come from? Heads. But how did tails create heads if heads wasn't there to create tails? And if heads was already there to create tails, then tails can't create heads because it already pre-existed tails. And therein lies the problem. This is what happens when you look at it and you make it halfway there, almost there, and then you pull out before you finalize the whole thing. He got very close, but he didn't fully make the leap yet. Because he's halfway there, but he's not fully there. If heads doesn't exist yet, then tails can't exist yet. So they can't create each other. They aren't there yet to have created each other. They can't both do it simultaneously because neither of them yet exist to create the other one. Here's how you break that. You can't do it binary, because if heads creates tails, then tails cannot yet have existed to create heads. And so then he says, oh, well, that's what makes it causally dynamic. And the heads and the tails create each other simultaneously. And yet that's impossible, because if heads wasn't yet there, then tails can't yet exist to create heads. So, I mean, and you can argue this forever. You can say that the person that says that that's not true just doesn't get it, but I do get it. He's saying they both create each other simultaneously. The problem with that is that if you reduced it to a binary where it's just one and then the other, not and then, but there's one and the other, and then that's it. And there isn't one before the other, and there isn't one after the other. It's just one and the other simultaneously, causally dynamically. It almost makes sense, but the reason that it doesn't make sense is because there's only two of them. And it'll make sense if you think about if there was only one of them. Heads can't create itself because it wasn't yet there to have created itself. If you say heads can create tails, what created heads? Tails. But if tails created heads, then heads can't create tails. Why? Because a cause cannot be its own effect. If a cause causes itself, then its effect is the same as its cause, at which point it does not have a cause, because its cause is indiscernible from its effect. The effect, it's called bootstrapping. The problem with bootstrapping is like this. Imagine there's a computer that turns itself on. Imagine a house that builds itself. Imagine a woman who gives birth to herself. Where did she come from? Herself. But then, where did herself come from? Herself. How? We don't know. We just accept it because he has a smart British accent, so he must be right. You can't create yourself. There is nothing in existence that ever created itself. And then you could be like, well, but he's saying that one created the other. So did Adam create Eve? If you've got two parents that give birth to a child, did either parent give birth to the other parent? And then you'll see exactly what my point is. And then you'll be like, but that's linear causality. That happens afterwards. We're talking about the origin, where everything first began. And you could say that. Okay, after everything already came into being, then we start getting parents and children and parents and children and parents and children, and the cycle repeats and it's linear and all that. But at the origin, it was causally dynamic. And somehow, mommy created daddy. And somehow, mom gave birth to dad, and dad gave birth to mom. Or you had two moms who gave birth to each other. So, mom A and mom B. Mom A gave birth to mom B, and mom B gave birth to mom A. Try to imagine that, and if, again, we use Alan Watts' measure, because that's what he says, is what he uses to believe things or not. Is that conceivable? Can you conceive of one mother giving birth to another mother, and then that mother giving birth to the other mother at the same time? No, for the same reason that you can't envision the mother giving birth to herself, she cannot have given birth to her own mother. So here's how you fix it. You still use causal dynamism, but you put a third one in there. Okay? So now you have two parents making one child, which is what we see every fucking day. Everybody knows what that looks like. That's simple. So you get being and nothing, who are the parents, who give birth to their child, which is indiscernibility. And you get indiscernibility and being to give birth to nothing. And you get being and nothing to give birth to indiscernibility, and you have indiscernibility and being giving birth to nothing, and you have indiscernibility and nothing giving birth to being. So then you've got two parents giving birth to one child. Now it makes sense, because if you have nothing, you also have being, and you have indiscernibility. And if you have being and indiscernibility, then you have nothing. And if you have being and nothing, then you have indiscernibility. And if you have being and indiscernibility, you have nothing. And if you have nothing and indiscernibility, then you have being. Because those are the three absolutes, and there's nothing that exists, there's not even nothing that exists outside of them. That's the only way you can fix it. And so then what those things are not actually real, they're 2/3 real. So you've got A that is created by the conjunction of B and C, and you've got C which is created by the conjunction of A and B, and you've got B as created by the conjunction of A and C, and you've got A as being the product of the conjunction between B and C. So then the conjunction is not entailed in the product, and that's what allows you to have this causal dynamism without committing this fallacy where the conjunction is somehow entailed in its own product, which is the same thing as a mother trying to give birth to herself or a mother trying to give birth to her own mother. She cannot be her own mother or her own daughter because that is self-contradictory. And in the same way, if you have A and B, you can't say that A gave birth to B and B gave birth to A because that don't make no goddamn sense. So you have to add one extra one. And that's the one thing he didn't get.
The something and the nothing are inseparable. They go together. And in this way, you could say that the nothing is the force whereby the something can be manifested. Without space we couldn't see the stars. The stars not only occupy space, but have space between one point of the sphere and the opposite point. So there's space everywhere as absolutely basic to there being anything at all. Now, ordinarily, we think that what is basic to the physical world is something we call matter. And then matter has various shapes. We think of tables as made of wood. We think of pots as made of clay. But I ask you, is a tree made of wood in the same way as a table is? No, that would be stupid, isn't it? Because a tree is wood. It isn't made of wood. Wood and tree are two different names for the same thing. But there's in the back of our mind the notion, as a root of common sense, that everything in the world is made of something, made of some kind of basic stuff.
And I tried a 3-minute cybersecurity game, and it showed my strengths in the $70,000 to $120,000 salary range.
Some kind of basic stuff. And physicists, through the centuries, have, of course, wanted to know what that was. And physics began as a quest to discover the basic stuff out of which the world is made. And with all our advances in physics, we've never found it. What we have found is not stuff, but form. We have found shapes. We have found structures. Because when you turn up the microscope and you look at things where you thought there was some sort of stuff, you find instead form, pattern, structure.
See, I told you. I haven't even watched this part yet. You see, this is how I know what I'm talking about. Look at what he just said. I said it before. I predicted this. I understand his pattern. It's like I told you. Everything to Alan Watts is a structure, a form, an abstract image. Everything to Alan Watts is a relation. The problem is, if you reduce everything to form and pattern and structure, let's say it's a pattern. Let's really challenge ourselves and go for the most challenging one, the pattern. What if everything was a pattern? A pattern of what? Oh, well, other patterns. Great. So patterns of patterns. What the hell even is a pattern of a pattern? And can you compound that infinitely? And after you do that, what is that? Is that another pattern? It's a problem in believing that everything is my image of it. It's a form of solipsism in the sense of reducing everything to anything. And I said this to Sam once, and it really bears repeating. You can reduce everything to anything, but not without adding an infinite amount of nothing. Because you're negating, when you reduce everything to anything, even if it's a relation between things, you're still reducing it to that. You're saying that it's reducible to this pattern. You're saying it's reducible to this flavor, this image, this relation. So you're saying it's reducible to that. So then, if everything is reducible to that, it becomes the self-containing box. It becomes the pattern of the pattern. What is a pattern of a pattern? What is a form of a form? What is the structure of structure? And then you could be like, well, that's logic itself. Where did that come from? Oh, well, it just always has been. Really? Like being and nothing have always been? So maybe then the logic exists in between the being and the nothing, because I could easily corner you in there and say, well, logic obviously can't be nothing, so then it must be being. So then why is nothing inconceivable? Why won't it fit inside logic? Oh, but it does. the nothing creates the being and the being creates the nothing simultaneously, the mom gives birth to herself and or her own daughter, who then gives birth to her simultaneously. Not then, but during the birth, when Mom A gives birth to Mom B is giving birth to Mom A. Sorry, but someone can't give birth to their own mom. In the same way that someone can't give birth to themselves, because they're the same thing. If I give birth to myself, then I am my own mom, at which point I've given birth to my own mom. I can't pre-exist myself to create myself. I can't bootstrap myself into existence and just say, voila, here I am. Because where did I come from? How did I do that? There's no answer. It's just always been. It's insane. But it's easily done when you forget the distinction and the separation between the observer and the observation and the observed. And there's the three again. There's the observer, there's the observation, and then there's the observed. And you cannot say that the observer gives birth or creates the observed, and the observed creates the observer through the act of observation, even though that's what he wants to say. That's what he wants to say. Alan Watts wants to say, and like I said, this is a very high thought, and you have to go even higher than it to see that it isn't the highest. There is no highest, by the way. There is no highest thought. Anytime anybody ever reduces reality, everything, whatever you want to call it, reduces something to anything, they can't have done it without adding a near infinite amount of nothing, which excludes everything except that one thing. Because, like Alan Watts says, everything is creating everything else. But while that causal dynamism exists between all things, while everything is interconnected with everything else, there are three absolutes there in practice, not two. A mother cannot give birth to herself. A mother cannot give birth to her own mother. They're the same exact problem. A mother cannot give birth to her own mother because her mother has to pre-exist her. Now you say, but it's causal dynamism, and mother and daughter are linear connections. Fine. So A creates A. Is that valid? And if you say yes, I don't know what to tell you, but that's not valid. Because if A creates A, where did A come from? And then you say, well, it just came from A. Well, then what's beyond A? What's before A? Nothing. So then nothing caused A. And then you could say, well, no, because it was, causally dynamic. So the cause is wrapped up in itself. And then I say again, the problem is you can't have a cause be its own effect. You can't have an effect be its own cause. In the same way that you can't have a tree be its own seed. You can't have a mother be her own daughter. You can't have God creating God. You can't have the self create the self. The act of creation is a relation. It requires distance. It requires a cause and an effect. If I say that I created myself, or even better yet, that God created God's self, I've already committed a fallacy, because that's bootstrapping. It's a bootstrapping paradox. You can't have something that creates itself And you can't have something that gets created by something that it creates for the same reason. It's the same problem. You can't have something that is created by something that it creates because it wasn't there yet to have created it. And again, you could continue to argue all day long, well, you just don't get the point because it's causal dynamism. I understand causal dynamism, but you have to have two give birth to one. You can't have one give birth to the other. And the reason that makes a distinction is because it takes the conjunction out of the product. If the conjunction is tied into the product, then the definition defines itself. It's the same problem as a word that is used to define itself. A bat is a bat. Well, that doesn't explain what a bat is. Something cannot be its own definition. Something cannot create itself. And the definition can't be the thing that's being defined. And the thing that is created can't be its own creator. And the thing that is created can't be created by its own creation. Because I wasn't there yet to have created anything to create me. But if there were two other things that created me, and then I help in creating two other things, then you can have three absolutes in a causally dynamic creation. Nothing is the product of the conjunction between being and indiscernibility. Excuse me. When I say product, I mean the remainder or the result. So if you were to conjoin being and indiscernibility in that coin, then you would have nothing outside of it. If you were to put being and conjoin it with nothing in that coin, then you would get indiscernibility outside of it. And if you were to take that coin and conjoin it with being and indiscernibility, you would get nothing. And if you were to conjoin nothing and indiscernibility, you would get being. But you can't have a coin where you've got being creating nothing and nothing creating being. That doesn't make any fucking sense. Just say it. It makes no sense. Being created nothing and nothing created being. So then being doesn't create anything. So then there isn't anything there to create it. So then you're just saying that being just is timeless. But if being is really timeless, then it was uncreated. And if it wasn't even created, then we don't have creation. We don't have causal dynamism. Being just always was there, and nothing never was there. And if that's the coin that we're talking about, then the heads always existed, and the tails never existed. And now we've got a coin with one side. And that's what I'm saying. This idea that he has is very easy to fall into because it's the first step out of the box. What everybody first does before they think about anything is they think that everything is reducible to one thing. And then what Alan Watts is saying is that no. We can actually have something else there. And I appreciate that. It's a step in the right direction. Now we're talking about, instead of everything being reduced to just being, and then they're just being timeless being, obviously that can't happen because there is time, and I can tell what time it is, and therefore there isn't timelessness all the time. So if there was time, then there was a beginning, and if there was a beginning, then there was nothing before the beginning, and so now we've got nothing and being. We don't just only have being. So you can't only have one. You have to have the other. So he's right about that. But you also have to have a third in order for it to fully develop into a formalizable, non-contradictory, actual paradigm. He's so close to it. So he's right. You go from 1 to 2. Okay, great, good. but then he stops. Then you have to go from 2 to 3. When you get to 3 absolutes, then you have the bare minimum number of absolutes necessary to formally actually have causal dynamism. Because you've got 2 distinct independent variables conjoined, and the result of that conjunction is the third absolute. And that third absolute doesn't have a conjunction, which is already in the premise. And I'll show you in formal theory why this doesn't work. P and Q, therefore R, works, right? Because then we can say that they're all distinct. Here's where things don't work. P and, let's say P and Q, right? Therefore P, well, let's see, how would that work? P and Q, therefore P and Q. That does work also, but there's no time in there, and there's no space in there, other than the space between a premise and a conclusion. So the formal problem of why you can't have a binary causally dynamic origin, you have to have a tertiary, I guess that would be the right word. You have to have 3. You can't have 2. You can't have 1 for sure. He obliterates the 1, and I applaud him for that. But then he gives us this binary duality of 2, and only 2, and tells us that that's sufficient. It's not. You have to have 3. If I say that the result of P is Q, and the result of Q is P, then what I'm saying is P, therefore Q, and then I'm saying Q, therefore P, right? That's the formal way of putting what he said. P, therefore Q, Q, therefore P. How do we know that P ever existed? Well, because of Q. But how do we know that Q existed? Because of P. Well, that's the same thing as saying P, therefore P. Now, what is P, therefore P? Now, most logicians would say that's a tautology, but it ain't. Why? Because the conclusion is the same as the premise. Now, if the conclusion is the same as the premise, then we have an indiscernibility, and there is no logic in between the premise and the conclusion, because the premise and the conclusion are indiscernible and interchangeable with each other. If your premise is interchangeable with your conclusion, you do not have a tautology, you have a fallacy. And the reason that you have a fallacy is for the same reason that a mother cannot give birth to herself. You cannot have P, therefore P, because if you have P, therefore P, we don't know if P is true, because we have no logical validity, because there's no space in between P and P. There's no time in between P and P. There's no time to separate premise from conclusion. They're the same thing. So then they're neither a premise nor a conclusion, because a premise has to be separated from its conclusion, because you have to conclude something from a premise. There's no logical validity inside a singularity because there's nothing there to relate to. Now, then you could say, but what about the self relation? Doesn't x equal x? Well, yes, of course x equals x. But imagine if P was false empirically, right? And imagine that we draw a conclusion. Now, in logic, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, right? So then we say, well, we can't presume that the premise is false, because then we don't get to draw a conclusion, because the whole of logical deduction relies on the single function. If the premise is true, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. right? So, if P is true, then P is true. And so then logicians would say, but that's a tautology. No, it's not a tautology, because there's not enough room for a relation to exist there, because P is interchangeable with P. So if P is presumed to be true because it's given in the premise, and then we conclude that, we're not able to draw the conclusion yet because we haven't had space or time in between P and anything else to draw a relation. So then we can't draw a conclusion because there's no relation, because there's no integration, because there's no validity, because there's no difference between P and P. So if I presume that P is true and I give the premise P is true, I can't draw a conclusion from just only that, because its justification doesn't rest on logic, it rests on whatever made me presume that it was true to begin with. That's why it's not a tautology. A tautology has to have at least two premises conjoined. In order to derive an implication, you have to have a conjunction. You have to have at least two things in order to draw a conclusion from those two things. If you have one thing, then you're just axiomatically presuming that it's true twice. Because if P is true, doesn't make P true. If is not a conclusion. If is a binary disjunction. Because if means it could be or it could not be. That's what if means. It's a necessary dichotomy. It's not a monism. It's not necessarily reducible to one thing. In fact, it's necessarily dualistic. And because an implication is necessarily dualistic, it can't be reduced to a singularity in which the conclusion is the same and interchangeable with its premise. You can't have a mother give birth to herself. You can't have something create itself. If I say that P is true, and then I conclude, after having said that P is true, where's the logic? There isn't any room for logic. If I presume that P is true, then the truth of P is wrapped up in the presumption, in my assertion, in my subjective arbitration, not logic. But before the logic even gets a chance to be applied, I just have restated my original assertion. If P is true, then P is true. But we haven't had room to determine whether P is true or not because we just presume it to be true to begin with. Well, where is the logic in presuming that P is true? And it's the same thing as I had said before about nothing. You can't derive a conclusion from no premise. Well, you also can't derive a conclusion from one premise. You can only draw a conclusion from at least two premises, and they have to be distinct and not interchangeable. P cannot equal Q and then still allow you enough room to draw a conclusion because there's not enough room for relativity. There's nothing there to relate to. And if you say it's going to relate to itself, then again, all we're talking about is some variable that we know nothing about. If it's relating to itself, then its properties are relating to each other. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Then you've got one property is one premise, and then another property is the second premise. And then you draw the conclusion about whether or not it's true, based upon the logical validity and the non-contradiction between those two premises, those two properties. But if I take it as a whole, totality, without using any properties at all, just P. We don't know what P is, right? That's why I like using it. And we presume and we give P as true. We can't conclude shit because there's not enough room. Because the only thing that we have to say that P is true is based off of our presumption that it's true. So when I conclude that P is true, the only thing that I'm concluding is that my presumption was a presumption. So what? If I presume that something is true, does that make it automatically logical? Well, one would think so if one asserts a smuggled in assertion that everything is logical automatically, that logic exists independently of everything else, and there is no such thing or time or place or event in which logic didn't exist, which is exactly what the field of logic does because it's the field of logic. But what makes that true? And then we only have the inside of it to tell. Well, the way that the parts integrate with each other. But if all there is just one thing, how can we say that that's truly integrated? And I'll give you an example. Use nothing as a premise. Well, you can't, because if I make a premise, that's not nothing. So the nothing won't fit in the premise. And it's the same thing as presuming P and then concluding P based off of my presumption that P exists. It's an exact restatement. It's redundant. It's exactly the same thing. My conclusion that P is true is identical to my presumption that P is true. They both rest on exactly the same justification, which is my axiomatic assertion that P is true. Not logic. There's no room for logic because I just presumed it. Now, if I presume that P is true, and I presume that Q is also true, then I can draw the conclusion that both P and Q are true conjunctively. But I can't say anything about P itself in and of itself or Q itself in and of itself. I can assert premise P, and then I can assert premise Q, and then I can conclude P and Q. Why? Because the logic then exists between the non-contradiction and the independence between P and Q, and therein lies the magic of logical deduction. That is the measure of what makes something logically deducible, is that the premises have to be independent from each other and yet both intersect. Geometrically, you're taking two lines and you're seeing where they intersect. So you've got line A and line B, premise A, premise B, and the conclusion, C, is where they intersect. If they don't intersect, then you don't have a logical connection between the two, and you say that it's either a non sequitur, there is no connection, or you say that the connection that they have is heuristic, it's logically fallacious. And then you say that the conclusion must then be false. In either case, you cannot conclude that something is true unless you have two independent premises. And like I said, with geometry, it would be like having two lines and then checking where they intersect. Because that's how you can determine that they're lines. If they never intersected, if they're parallel to each other, then we don't have any interaction between the two lines. So then we have to have a third line that intersects them both in order to determine, for example, what let's say if you were to imagine two x-axes, they're both horizontal and they both are infinite and they both go on forever and they're both parallel and they never intersect each other. How do you determine whether some given point on one of those is to the left or to the right of some other given point? If they never intersect, we can't tell if one of them shifts or moves around or not. If we're using two parallel lines that never intersect, and we ask the question, is one of those lines longer than the other line? We can never know the answer to that without a y-axis that's orthogonal to them both, which intersects them both. If we have two x-axes and they're parallel to each other, but yet there's no y-axis, then both those x-axes combine into one. And then we say that it intersects 0. And that's how we say it's an axis to begin with, is that it intersects 0. But without an intersection, we can't determine if that line even exists, let alone how to discern any point on it from any other point on it. Because if all you ever had was one infinite line and there was no zero, and you never zeroed in on any part of that line, and you just had this one infinite line, try to imagine that, where you don't have any intersection with this line, no connection with this line. You can't visualize it, because if you're outside the line, then your line of sight intersects with it. So if nothing intersects with this line, you can't see it. In the same way that if the light never bounces off the object, you can't see it. If there was a light that shone and yet never reflected off of any surface, you would never see it. That's the weird thing. It's a light, but you can't see it because it never bounces off of anything. There has to be a connection. That's the deducibility of something, is the connection between two things. And that is why logic is always relativistic. And that's why logic uses at least two premises to draw every conclusion. Without two premises, there's no logical connection between the premises to draw the conclusion from. Logical deduction happens between the premises. The conclusion happens between the premises. Every conclusion is the result of a conjunction of at least two premises. If you don't have a conjunction, you don't have a conclusion. If you don't have an intersection, you don't have a line. The line has to intersect some point. So, all of this is to say that you cannot have, as Alan Watts points out, you can't have a monism, but you also can't have a dualism. Because black can't create white if black is created by white. In the same way that Sally can't give birth to Susie if Susie gives birth to Sally. They can't both give birth to each other because it's happening at the same time, and yet neither of them existed first to create the other one. You have to have two to create the one. Susie and Jim can give birth to Sally, and Sally and Jim can give birth to Susie, but Susie can't give birth to Sally, and Sally give birth to Susie simultaneously. It just doesn't work. There's not enough room for logic.
You find instead form, pattern, structure. You find
Of something.
And you go in beyond the shapes of crystals and you find molecules.
Of
You go
something.
in beyond molecules and you find atoms.
Of
You
something.
go in beyond atoms and you find electrons and
Of
positrons,
something.
between which
There you go.
there are vast spaces.
Yep.
And we
And you can't have those vast spaces without having both of those things. There is no space in a singularity. If everything were one thing, there would be no space or distance to see it. You can't discern a singularity because you would be part of it because it's a singularity. There's only one thing. But if there's two things and you're outside of those two things, then you can draw a relation between those two things. Either, let's say, the singularity and yourself. So then the singularity is only a singularity according to itself. But you also exist in conjunction with it. And then there'd have to be some third thing that would have created both of you and been created by both of you. Whoops. Let's see, what is this? Houseboat. Boathouse. Is it a houseboat or a boathouse?
Time is a very difficult thing to pin down. There's a famous saying of St. Augustine of Hippo, that when he was asked, "What is time?" he said, "I know what it is, but when you ask me, I don't." And yet it seems absolutely fundamental to our life.
It is.
Time is money, we say. I don't have enough time. Time flies. Time drags. And I think we should go into the question of what this is, because in our ordinary common sense,
But let's take a hit of pop
we
first.
think of time as a one-way motion from the past through the present and on into the future. And that carries along with it another impression, which is to say that life moves from the past to the future in such a way that what happens now and what will happen is always the result of what has happened in the past. In other words, we seem to be driven along. You know, once upon a time it was fashionable in psychology for people to speak of man's and animals' instincts. That we have, for example, an instinct for survival, an instinct to make love, and so on. But nowadays that word has become unfashionable, and psychologists tend instead to use the word drives, and to speak of the need for food as a drive, the need for survival or for sex as drives. And that's a very significant word, because it's brought out, isn't it, by people who feel driven. Now, I must say personally, if I feel hungry, I don't feel driven. Also, if I feel lusty, I don't feel driven, because I don't say, "Oh, excuse me, but I have to eat," or "Excuse me, but I need to fulfill my sexual urges, my biological impulses." I say, "Hooray, I identify myself with my drives. They're me, and I don't take a passive attitude towards them and apologize for them." So the whole idea of our being driven is connected with the idea of causality, of life moving under the power of the past. And that is so ingrained in our common sense that it's very difficult to get rid of it, because I want to turn the thing round completely the other way
Okay, let's do it.
and say that the past is the result of the present. Let us suppose, just for the sake of example, that this universe started with a big bang, as some cosmologists believe. Now, when that bang happened, it was the present, wasn't it? And so the universe began in what we will call a now moment. Then it goes on doing its stuff. And always, when any event that we now call past came into being, it came into being in the present and out of the present. That's one way of seeing it. But before we get further involved in this, I want to draw your attention to a fallacy in the very common sense idea of causality. That events are caused by previous events, from which they flow or result necessarily. To understand the fallacy of that idea, we have to begin by asking, what do you mean by an event? Let's take the event of a human being coming into the world. Now, when does that event begin? Does it occur at the moment of parturition, when the baby actually comes out of its mother? Or does the baby begin at the moment of conception? Or does the baby begin when it was an evil gleam in its father's eye? Or does a baby begin when the spermatozoa are generated in the father, or the ovum in the mother? Or could you say a baby begins when its father is born, or when its mother?
So before he says his answer, let me give mine. The birth happens at the integration of one solid unit that is capable of being independent of any other unit for a non-zero duration, and let's see, because that's just, at this point we're still talking about gametes as being possibly part of the birth, right? So let's break this down before I go any further. So what Alan Watts is asking about is, when does something actualize and become something? And I'm sure if I know Alan Watts' paradigm well enough, then what he'll say is that there is no beginning, because everything is everything, and it's all wiggly. Now, that's very fanciful and that's very cute, but let me think about a real, actual answer, instead of just avoiding the answer with saying that the question itself is meaningless, which is, like I said, cute, but it doesn't actually answer the question. It just says that the question is meaningless. Now, to answer the question and actually answer it, then we have to define what is something. And this, again, like I had said in the last video, I can't tell you how many times that I've thought about being also, and how that's never defined. And like Alan Watts, I find nothing fascinating, and no one seems to understand the purity of nothing, such that they don't use it as if it were related to something else, because there's nothing there to relate to. So you can use it in a conjunction as... I didn't fully fledge this out. So when I said you can conjoin nothing with being to create indiscernibility, and you can conjoin nothing with indiscernibility to create being, the creation of that, or the cause of that, the effect of that, the cause and effect relation between those is like this. If there was some world or some modal possibility in which we posit that both nothing and indiscernibility are attempting to occupy the same place at the same time, the distinction between them is what being is. So if I were to take nothing in my left hand and indiscernibility in my right hand, and I were to conjoin them, clasp my hands together, that pattern of zigzag in between my fingers as they clasp each other, the intertwining between my hands as they clasp each other, is what defines what being is. And that means that the essence of being can be found in the distinction between nothing and indiscernibility, because we can tell the difference between nothing and indiscernibility. And in the same way that we tell the difference between nothing and indiscernibility, we can tell what nothing is. What being is. That was so confusing. So if we take nothing, and we know what that is, that's the absence of all things. And then we take indiscernibility, or the inconceivability of nothing. What happens when we try to interact with nothing is that we get indiscernibility, right? Indiscernibility is just like a fog. It's like not knowing. I can't tell, okay? The state of not being able to tell is distinct from nothing, and yet it's inextricably linked with nothing. So when we inextricably link nothing with indiscernibility, or the absolute absence of all things, and the state in which we can't tell what's going on, those are two completely different things, because the state in which we can't tell what's going on is a thing, it's a state, and so then it's necessarily excluded from the absolute exclusion of all things. indiscernibility is not nothing, and therefore it can't be nothing, and so then it has to be distinct and independent from nothing. And so then we, through that distinction between indiscernibility and nothing, we can then define and discern what being is. So when I say that you can conjoin nothing and indiscernibility, even though nothing isn't there to conjoin, then I'm demonstrating something that I can't quite describe. It's like when you attempt to conjoin nothing with indiscernibility, you're saying that there is no conjunction, that it's just indiscernibility itself, right? So then if you take indiscernibility and then a conjunction, because nothing isn't there to be conjoined, right? It's just indiscernibility and nothing. So there's indiscernibility and nothing, and then we've got indiscernibility and the conjunction, right? So because there's nothing there to be conjoined, then we've got indiscernibility and conjunction, not indiscernibility conjoined with nothing, because you can't conjoin nothing with indiscernibility. When you attempt to do so, you'll get indiscernibility by itself, and you'll get conjunction by itself. So let's take a look at that. So conjunction is when two things are combined into one thing so that they can both occupy the same place at the same time. And you can tell that even from an AND logic gate will do this. If you've got two things, two sensors or circuit opening points, and they're both set to the same value, let's say on, then you'll have electricity that's current flows through both of those into the same wire at the same time because they're both on. And when they are both on, it will switch the AND light on. And that's an AND logic gate. So mechanically, physically, the act of conjunction as a logical operator it's an analogy to having two circuits, both of which are on, and they have to both be on in order for the light to come on at the end of their conjunction, at the end of their connection. So to conjoin two things is when they both combine to become two parts of one whole, and then they occupy the same place at the same time. And they are then indiscernible from each other. So when indiscernibility is conjoined with that operation of conjunction, you've got indiscernibility and indiscernibility both having to be on at the same time for the electricity to flow into the same place, the wire, to flow into the end conjoined output. So the act of conjoining indiscernibility with indiscernibility is that indiscernibility is then non-contradictory with itself. So indiscernibility equals itself, which means that it's indiscernible what indiscernibility is. You can conjoin it with itself because it has a self-relation. And the self-relation of indiscernibility is like this. The global part of it as a totality, indiscernibility itself, is static. Because the only thing that it could change into would be discernibility. And these are like categories, or the set property, the property of the set of indiscernibility, is that it has to be the same all the time, globally. That set, that category, has to be the same all the time, because the only other category is discernibility. So If it were to change, it would change into discernibility. So it can't change. So then globally, as a set, it's static, does not change. That's its property as a global set. But what's distinct about indiscernibility is its parts, because locally, inside of indiscernibility, it must fluctuate all the time. Very much like 0-point energy, it has to have it's always randomly fluctuating locally. But globally, it never changes above 0. It's net 0, but it's got local pockets that are either up or down at any given time. And the average number of ones that are up are equal to the average of the ones that are down in any given area where there's multiple locations. So globally, it's static and unchanging at 0. But locally, it's fluctuating. And the reason is because if I were to ever keep all of its parts distinct, along with it as a whole being distinct, especially if the parts were distinct, then I'd be able to tell them apart from each other, and I would be able to build a solid form or structure, which would then be discernible, and then it would make the whole thing form into a crystalline structure, and then everything in it would be discernible, and so it would be discernible. And so what I believe happens is that's what happens, is that the local fluctuations will fluctuate until they reach a static integrated form and form a crystal, and then that is being. That's what happens when you manifest something. So the act of manifestation is the conjunction between indiscernibility as a totality or a set and indiscernibility as a property or a part or a locality. When those conjoin into something that's not contradictory, and that's what those do. When those local parts fluctuate, they do so in a way that makes the overall picture indiscernible. It's just random white noise, and you can't tell it from any other random white noise. They all sound the same. If you were to hear any white noise, you can recognize that pattern across all the examples within that set. So there's various different types of white noise. There's white noise on your radio when you tune into a station that isn't broadcasting. Or if you tune your radio to a frequency at which there's nothing coming in, you'll just get static. You don't get nothing, you'll get static. And you get static because there's always random radio waves floating throughout the air. And if you sit at that frequency and you don't move your car or your radio, it will just continue on and on and on and on and on. And you can't tell one segment from any other segment of white noise. If it's true white noise, you can take any 5 seconds of it and compare it with any other 5 seconds of it, and you won't be able to tell the difference. They'll sound identical. That's how indiscernibility has this conjunction in between its parts and its wholes. Its parts fluctuate randomly in almost a repeatable pattern, in a sense of it being like recognizable in the overall effect between all the parts, because it's random. It doesn't change. It doesn't go up or down or in or out. It just stays the same. It's the same all the time. And that's what makes it white noise. As opposed to, for example, green noise. Green noise, you can discern the difference, and that's why it's not in the same category as white noise. In green noise, you've got birds chirping, and that's, you can take any 2 or 3 segments of a bird chirp and tell it apart from another bird chirp, where it's, slightly off The order is different. It starts with a chirp and ends with silence rather than starting with silence and ending with a chirp. The segment will be discernible in that way if it's green noise, which admittedly is still in the conventional sense random, but it's not true random because you can determine the difference between one locality and another, between one instance and another. In true randomness, all possibilities are exactly equal. So being is then described as the conjunction between the parts of indiscernibility and the whole. And the parts and the whole conjoin into indiscernibility, where it's globally static and yet locally fluctuating. And then it becomes real because it has parts and a whole. Now, if you were to take all of the individual parts of indiscernibility, which is all indiscernibles, then how do you discern one indiscernible from another? Well, you say, so Leibniz's law of indiscernibles states that if any two indiscernibles or things share at least one property, if they share all their properties, then they're the same thing. They have to share all their properties to be considered the same thing. So, globally, or as a set, all indiscernibles share the property of being indiscernible. So, in the set sense, they're interchangeable. But in the local sense, they're distinct because you can discern one from the other because they don't share all of their properties in the local sense. Inside of indiscernibility, its parts fluctuate, either up or down, or left or right, or in or out, or whatever the relation is. But that relation is always balanced by its opposite. So what you end up with is a series of axes, or relations, between these local parts. And even though the parts themselves are indiscernible, the relations between them are. And if you were to collect all of those relations, then you would have a globally static arrangement. Now, granted, that wouldn't be, forever. It would only be a snapshot of a single instance. But yeah, you could render that which is indiscernible discernible, but it would only be discernible for that moment. And you would never be able to predict what it would be in the next moment, based off of whichever moment that you have, or series of moments either, other than a general global pattern that it will remain generally balanced. And that's something to be said in and of itself, that being seeks balance. And what do we see with all beings is that they seek balance. I only desire food when I'm hungry, but when I'm full, I don't desire food anymore. I only desire sex until I have it. And then after I've had it, and I've filled my satiation, as much as I can, given the satiation level of my partner being reached, at least one of us, hopefully both, will be satiated, and then we won't have the feeling of wanting it anymore. So all being seems to be about balance, and that balance then allows for us to discern, because it's an axis, so we can determine where one point will be on it relative to another, given the straightness of that axis. If we were to combine all possible axes, we would get a dimension. If we combine all possible dimensions, then we get the totality of that object. So as we increase from singular point to 2 points, to 3 points, and then eventually to an infinite number of points, saturating the field or dimension, and then combine multiple dimensions, as we do that, we will learn what is real, and we'll gain a higher understanding of what is real mentally. Spiritually, that can help us if we apply it subjectively. We can help our relations with each other become more sustainable and balanced. And eventually we can, as a series of relations, a community, crystallize and become a solid being, a solid object, and just sustain ourselves for an indefinite amount of time, however long our parts remain integrated. So if we then choose to unite over something that is universally something that everyone wants, something that everyone needs, such as the defense of human rights, so that we can all access the things that we need to survive, and we unite under that, and we say at least that. The first thing that we can agree on is that every single individual is given the right to access the opportunity to obtain food and shelter and clothing and sex and all of those things equally. And totally, to the extent that those needs are all met, that they're all 100% satiated for our survival, our longevity, right? So we don't want to become obese and reduce our lifespan. We don't want to become anemic and reduce our lifespan, or anorexic and reduce our lifespan. I don't know why I said anemic. Anyway, we don't go towards either extreme. We try to remain in the moderate middle so that we can sustain ourselves as long as possible. And to the degree to which we can sustain ourselves is good. And to the depth to which we can integrate the number of things that we agree on, good. And to the number of things that we can agree on in predicting the future about where we want to go and what we want to do and how we want to create the future, good. And as long as we allow everybody else to do what they want to do and choose to do whatever they want to do, good, because that all allows for the maximization of this process to continue. And the process seems to be that we go from nothing to indiscernibility to discernibility. And we do so because globally, indiscernibility is already a thing. It can't change. And then locally, it has to fluctuate over and over and over until it's already gone through all of its possible permeations. And it only has so many. Eventually, it will recur. And when it recurs, then it crystallizes, it becomes a thing because it's repeatable. It's a cycle. It perpetuates itself. It repeats. And so if it doesn't repeat, then it doesn't propagate. If it does repeat, then it repeats as long as it doesn't interrupt someone else's or its own propagation. If it operates in a way where it destroys all the other things that are around it, the reason that that's a problem for itself is if it becomes imbalanced, let's say to the point where all of the field is it, then it would become discernible. So it can't do that. The field as itself has to remain indiscernible. So for every bit that attempts to become discernible, then there's an equally opposing bit that becomes indiscernible. For every up, there's a down. So if it does try to integrate too largely, then it will be disintegrated because it can't be sustained over the entire field, that every single point becomes discernible. Because if every point becomes discernible, there is no more indiscernibility. If there's only being and nothing and no indiscernibility between the two, then it becomes impossible whether you've got the mother giving birth to herself or her own mother. And so then you need that third. The instant that indiscernibility becomes discernible, saturated all throughout, where every single point is discernible in it, and it loses all of its indiscernibility, and the randomness is unmasked as being some very, very, very complex but repeatable pattern, then at that point where indiscernibility is saturated with being and everything has become discernible and there is nothing that is indiscernible, at that very instant, when the very last particle or particles become discernible, at that very instant, indiscernibility appears in between where the same nothing has always been and where the indiscernibility was, and where it became discernible. At that area, volume, whatever, multidimensional space, at which things became saturated and fully discernible, at that area, at the edge of that area, beyond that, there's nothing. When that whole area becomes saturated with being, it ceases to be a limit between being and nothing, and it becomes being, which then instantaneously causes indiscernibility, a new limit, to form just beyond it. And being then is destined to always grow larger, so that things become more solid and more integrated over time. But that the total field never achieves full crystallization. Because like I said, that very instant in which those last particles became discernible is the very instant that indiscernibility reappears on the other side of them, on the other side of discernibility, on the other side of that volume or multidimensional space, on the other side of it, where nothing is, in between nothing and it, there's a new limit that has to form. And that causes that indiscernibility, again, to decay into being, which then causes a new indiscernible limit beyond it, and beyond it, and beyond it, and beyond it, and eventually it grows and grows and grows, and that's what being does. Some could argue at the expense of nothing and indiscernibility, and if you do look at things like that, you'll I say you'll go to hell, but it's not because anyone put you there, it's because you put yourself there. If you think about it in that way, then existence, being, becomes a crime because it's encroaching upon the other two. But if you take the side of being and you like being, and you say being is good, then it's a good thing because it's the underdog, overcoming the odds against the other two. You can look at it either way, and it really depends on the specifics. It's like, do you like these types of people, or would you prefer that they didn't exist, or at least that you didn't have to see them or know that they existed? Indiscernibility. Or are you so radical a person that you accept literally everyone and you want to be everyone's friend, like Jesus, and just take everyone's side? Because you can approximate that in your real life, but you can never fully do it the way Jesus Christ did. It cannot be replicated. No other person will ever do that. And if you ever see someone else do it, it'll be one person, and it will be Jesus Christ, and he or she will do that, and that will be it. And they will sustain that indefinitely, or they'll die and no one else will repeat it. Or if it does get repeated, it means they came back for a third coming. Maybe they'll give us a new prophecy when they come back. Then maybe there will be a new era that we get to hear about that's beyond the 1,000 years of messianic reign, where Christ reigns supreme over the whole world. And then during that reign, he may give us a new prophecy. Those of us who remain, I may not be one of them, but the people who remained will get a new prophecy about what will happen, or something, or not, I don't know. But I think that I kind of diverged quite a bit here. And I'm running out of time. So I think what I would say is, he's very close, but there's certain things that he doesn't fully expound upon. And we can't ever fully realize these absolutes because they're absolutes. So we use all three of them, and we have the relation. Oh, that's what I was talking about. How to extract being from the conjunction of indiscernibility as a whole to indiscernibles as parts. And when you can join them, then you get being. Because the parts will eventually, like I say, cycle through, because they only have so many of these axes to saturate until they eventually saturate them all. And then they will eventually recur. They'll go in the same place twice. When they do that, they've already established some kind of an order, and that order then leads them as individuals to become discernible. And you could think of it mechanically like an easterly flowing wind and a westerly flowing wind coming into contact and creating a hurricane or a whirlpool of air between them, where they cycle around each other and create a mutually self-perpetuating, or not a mutually self-perpetuating, mutually perpetuating loop. And like I say about the creation thing, remember that that is not creation. That is transformation. Creation is when you don't have anything pre-existing it. It just appears out of the void, out of nothing. Where there was once nothing, then it appears. That's creation. So strictly speaking, only God creates. God created nature, and then if you discount God and you don't want to believe in God, you can say nature creates. But what we do is we transform from the derivatives that nature gives us. We transform those, and we don't create energy or create matter. We just transform it. We transform its arrangement, its relations with each other. Now, if you were to combine those, you get being. If you were to combine the set of all indiscernible things as indiscernibles, the parts, with the whole set itself as a totality, if you combine those, conjoin those, then you get being as the result, because the parts can only fluctuate so much, because they exist in a static structure globally. Their environment is ultimately static. That means that they can only have so much randomness until it runs out. So it's kind of counterintuitive if you have already baked the idea of the second law of entropy or thermodynamics into your head, and you believe that entropy is always rising. It rises, yes, but there's eventually, if you go beyond the system that it's rising in, if you go system beyond that, system beyond that, system beyond that, if you eventually go beyond all those systems, you'll see there's an order that there has to be, and it becomes more and more crystalline the more layers you add onto it. And eventually you'll start to see patterns in the sand, as I call it. You'll see patterns in randomness, and you'll be able to see cycles repeating. Now, they'll be very disparate. You'll have some that take 10 quadrillion steps to replicate, but they will. And they may only last for 2 cycles, but they'll last. And it'll go through its process until it's complete. And you, given enough time, will eventually see these things. A person will. People will eventually see these things. They may not recognize it, but it will happen. And so, we can cry over spilled milk. We can say, wham, 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 poor nothing and poor indiscernibility. And I have. And I've gone there. And I've claimed that existence is a crime, that being is a crime, because it's encroaching necessarily, always, compoundingly, invading and penetrating and infesting and causing and raping indiscernibility and nothing. I've been there. That's hell if I've ever known it. But if you take the side of being, or better yet, if you understand the necessity of all 3 of those things existing at the same time, then you can be in a position to say that existence is good, or at the very least that it's neutral and balanced and necessary, and that's just the way that it is. And if you reject that, then you're crazy, because it's not changing. And it's independent of you, so you can either accept it or you can deny it, but it's there, and it's always been there, and it's always going to be there, and that's just the way it is. And there is a beginning to everything. So yeah, there was a time, if you want to say a time, in which there wasn't creation, and that's when everything was just God. And God is ineffable, totally beyond any description, because God is beyond the three absolutes. God is what created the three absolutes. And it's possible, I'm leaning towards the idea, that God might be the causally dynamic function, the actual causal dynamism itself between the three absolutes, whereby the three absolutes all create each other, and each two create the other one. So being and indiscernibility creates nothing. Being and nothing creates indiscernibility. And indiscernibility and being creates nothing. And indiscernibility and nothing creates being. And they all create each other in that way. And the creation of those three is through and of and by and for, I think, causal dynamism. Which is I would say equal. I mean, equal in the fullest extent, I guess, because you could be like, it's asymmetrically equal because they're changing all the time. But if you think about it, at one point, pretty much everything was already nothing and indiscernibility. And then over time, actually, in the very beginning, almost everything was nothing because it all starts from a single point. So in the reference frame of creation, like if we were to take a snapshot of the reference frame, length and width, the TV screen grows every moment or something like that. Well, if you were to take where it is now and then rewind the clock backwards so that the reference frame remains the same size as it is right now, but the referent that it's focused on, the display on the screen, shrinks because we're going backwards in time, and being always grows. As we approach the future, it grows. As we approach the past, it shrinks. We go all the way back to the origin where all of them created each other, and being was only one point. And indiscernibility was just inside of that, and then nothing was inside of it. And then there was nothing outside of it also. And then there was indiscernibility in between the outside nothing and being. So that there's two indiscernibilities sandwiching being in between two nothings. So only being is singular, and then you've got a duplicity of indiscernibility and nothing. And this is the cry from them, from the nothing and the indiscernibility, is that they are being ripped apart, and they are being, put into a duplicitous state where they're both in and yet out, where they're both here and yet there, where they're both existent and yet not existent. They have this really painful, uncomfortable contrast with being. Being, conversely, is, at least inwardly, totally at peace, but it has to confront the other two. But even its confrontation is mediated by the neutrality and passivity and inevitability of indiscernibility decaying into being, into discernibility. And so, like I say, you could say that that's a bad thing if you take their side on it, or you could say that it's a good thing if you take God's side, or being's side, at the very least. And that's really a subjective choice, and all of us have to make that choice. And we make it every moment to the degree to which, and toward whatever it is specifically, and away from whatever it isn't specifically. And then we go from there and we evolve over time, and eventually we all crystallize, we all figure out our place, and then, we're at peace, and then we form kind of like the garrison unit of the military. We're no longer on the front lines. We have earned our time and now we're garrisoned in the back, as the reserve, in case something goes wrong, and it never goes wrong for us anymore because we're in garrison now. That's where it's all headed. Now, you could, like I say, claim that that's bad, but if you do that, you'll feel bad. And, this is the only argument really that it comes down to, because when you're in it, you're in it. And you'll realize if you're in it, you're going to feel it. And when you feel that, you're not going to like it, and you will eventually avoid it, and you'll just eventually end up with being. So, it just is. It just is what it is. Now, you can get reincarnated as many times as you want. You can go through this cycle as many times as you want. You're never going to become nothing, and you're never going to become indiscernibility. They both decay into being. And being always grows. Always. So, we're basically doomed to success, is what I like to call it. And this is what I was saying about all things being already perfect, because when you look at it from that perspective, it becomes timeless, because you're saying eventually everything becomes good. It all used to be almost pure evil, and now it's becoming better, and it's going to be better, and it's going to be good. Versus things are getting worse, and everything is decaying, and everything is evil, and how dare existence exist, and it's encroaching on people's rights and things like that. And like I say, you can argue that. You can always argue that. But you'll always argue it less in the future than you did in the past. Or you'll have less ability or justification for it. Because in the past, we used to kill each other more often than we do now. In the past, people used to starve to death more than they do now. And we can always say that in general. Now, there's local fluctuations, to be sure. And there are, always trees that get lost in the forest. And so you can definitely get lost in that forest if you want. But eventually you'll realize that it is a forest, and the forest is always growing. Whether or not a particular tree in it dies or gets born, ultimately the forest will grow. And ultimately, the trees will die. And they die, hopefully, less often, or less with more time to spare for each tree, and each tree lives longer, hopefully, than its predecessors. Again, generally, if we go across all the species, eventually the redwoods, if they're able to live in many diverse areas, will eventually overtake the world because they grow the biggest. So if we've got those in every area and they are the biggest and they last the longest, then eventually most of the trees will be them because they'll crowd all the other ones out. You see? So over time, eventually, all that local fluctuation simmers on down, settles on in, to a particular orderly self-perpetuating pattern that integrates all of its parts into a self-perpetuating loop. And that's what sustains it over time. And that, I believe, is God's blessing to us all. And that is the rain that is falling on both the evil and the good, irregardless, because God is the most high and is the most holy, that we're able to, by his grace alone, because we didn't fucking earn this shit, get given it.